this year.
All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and welcome everybody. I think we will have a few members joining us because we were expecting, I think, all but one or two to be able to be here today. I think we have Earl Nye, one of our members, is calling in and attending by phone. Earl, can you speak back to us? I never know with technology. But maybe he's listening in. We have a few members who weren't able to join us in December, and I will start to my immediate right and pick on my fellow coordinating board member and, in fact, our board secretary and chair of our agency operations committee. And those of you who weren't able to be here in December, if you'll just, in fact, we'll just go around the table and everybody will reintroduce themselves.
Okay, Brenda Payovich, board member, Higher Education Coordinating Board, and president of Brenda Payovich Group.
Ray Messer, president of Walter P. Moore & Associates Engineering Company out of Houston.
Jesse Rogers, vice president for Midwestern State University. President, I'm sorry. Yeah, I have been.
Did you demote yourself?
Yeah. I had that on my mind. I'm sorry.
Robert Posada, the trustee of the Alamo Colleges in San Antonio.
Mike McKinney, I'm the chancellor of the Texas A&M system. I was fixing to give Jesse a better job.
Rick Francis, I'm chairman of Bank of the West in El Paso and on the Board of Regents of Texas Tech University System.
My name is Elmo Cavan. I'm the interim president of the Texas Tech University Health Science Center, but my day job is the chief financial officer at the institution.
Ben Farrell, executive vice president for finance and administration at Austin Community College.
Hello, Greg Williams, President, Odessa College.
Scott Kelly, I'm Executive Vice Chancellor for Business Affairs at the University of Texas System.
Woody Hunt from El Paso, Chairman of Hunt Companies, and also serve as the current Chairman of the Governor's Business Council.
Ernest Angelo, an independent petroleum engineer from Midland.
Raymond Paredes, Commissioner of Higher Education.
And I'm Fred Heldenfels. Earl, are you on?
I can't hear.
You're going to have to speak really directly into the microphone.
Okay.
So everybody needs to have their microphones about 3 inches from their mouth when they're speaking, so that the audio folks on the outside can hear.
Earl, is that better? Can you hear?
That is a little bit better, yes. Thank you.
Go ahead and introduce yourself to all these folks who just introduced themselves to you and you didn't know it.
Barry.
Did you hear me?
They're going to work.
Earl, are you still there?
Yes, I can just barely hear you.
Okay. We've got microphones the size of 2 golf balls, and I've got about 3 inches from that microphone, so
Now that I can hear you
I disagree with any knowledge of our technological capabilities.
I'm very sorry to cause this problem. I wish I could be there in person.
Well, we're glad you're here by phone. Thank you, Earl. I'm Fred Heldenfels, and President and CEO of Heldenfels Enterprises, Inc., and Vice Chairman of the Coordinating Board, and by luck of the draw, Chairman of this advisory committee. And I very much appreciate each and every one of y'all's participation in it. I also want to bring y'all up to speed. We have, as I mentioned at our December meeting, we have hired a couple of consultants to help facilitate our meetings and produce our ultimate report and recommendations. I want to introduce Patty Summerfield, who is the professional facilitator that we've hired, which will allow us. Patty, you want to stand up and take a bow?
Thank you very much. I think I've met everybody.
Well, Patty brings a full and varied career. She earned her MBA from UT Austin, spent 16 years in sales and marketing for IBM, opened her own organizational consulting firm, and later became a partner in a PR firm, led their employee communications group for branding and marketing initiatives, and has facilitated hundreds of these types of meetings for both public and private sector. And I think she's going to be able to handle and wrangle us. So that is her role. We also have secured the services of the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems to assist us by providing subject matter expertise to critically evaluate our work and draft our report for adoption by the coordinating board and submission to the governor. NCHEMS, which is a long set of initials, has done a substantial amount of work on higher education cost efficiencies, and many of their publications have been provided as part of your background notebooks. In fact, Dennis Jones and Ames McGinnis, with a couple of their principals, were support to the Select Commission on Higher Ed and Global Competitiveness a little over a year ago that Woody Hunt chaired. We have with us here today Patrick Kelly. Patrick, are you here? Patrick is representing the what do you call yourselves for short? NCHEMS? NCHEMS, okay. That's a lot easier than the initials. Which includes Dennis, who I mentioned earlier, who's president, and Ames, who is senior associate. Patrick is senior associate at NCHEMS and also serves as director of the Information Center for State Higher Education Policy Making and Analysis. And he's currently completing his Ph.D. in Urban and Public Affairs at the University of Louisville. So I guess we'll be calling you Dr. Patrick Kelly soon. Thank you for being here, Patrick. So those are some of the experts we've hired to help facilitate and pull together our work. Let's see. Where did we put... did you find your name, David?
Here it is.
Sit down and they'll bring it to you.
You're over there.
Oh.
Sorry. Can't sit here.
Thank you for being here, David. I'm going to turn it over to the commissioner to give us a few brief comments on the committee's charge.
Well, I won't say very much. I think we need to get to work. You all know what the charge is. I can tell you that when I have my regular meetings with the governor's chief of staff, the primary point of conversation the last couple of meetings has been how's the cost efficiency committee doing, and obviously the work that you all are doing is critically important for the state, particularly in this tough economic environment. I can tell you that I've received phone calls from around the country. People are very interested in what Texas is doing on this issue, and I'm very optimistic about the outcomes and what we can do to improve educational outcomes in Texas at the greatest level of cost efficiency. So with that, let's move ahead with the agenda.
Thank you, Raymond. The first item, a little housekeeping. Hopefully everybody got a chance to review the minutes from our last meeting. Does anyone have any changes, additions, etc., to the minutes from our last meeting? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve those minutes, preferably from somebody who was actually there.
So moved.
We have a motion from Roberto and a second from Elmo. All in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed, same sign. That takes care of approving the minutes, so we'll dive right into our subject matter. By the way, at the very end of the meeting, we're spending a little bit of time talking about what the subject matter and the topics for our upcoming meetings will be in the months between now and May. Patty?
Yes, just a couple of things for those of you who walked in late. I'm Patty Somerville. I'm the facilitator. And I will tell you, tonight I have a meeting with 20 parents of elementary schools and who are deciding on boundaries, so y'all don't scare me a bit. So here's just a couple of things. I put a handout on your desk that says begin with the end in mind. This looks so simple. If we can just fill out these recommendations, we could get through today. But I think we have a couple more meetings.
The mic?
In the mic?
Yes.
In the mic.
Yes.
Okay. What I'd like you to do, though, is on the next couple of pages, and we can go over this later, just know that these are simply for you to take down ideas as the day progresses. As you have ideas that come up because of the presentations, just list them here. At the end of today, we will be working in small groups and then the larger group to come up with some ideas that came out of today's presentations. Okay? So there's just several pages on the end that are all alike, and they're for your notes. Any ideas? Last thing is, three things that'll help us. At a micro level, my job is just to make sure we are on time today, and that we start and end each presentation on time, and that I cut off anything that is off topic. So three things that makes my job much easier. Stay on topic, talk in nuggets, not novels. Nuggets are no more than 2 minutes long. If you can narrow down things to 3 sentences, that's perfect. And one conversation, which y'all all know these rules. Think of me as your mama. I think Roberta already said that. Or your drill sergeant, or your menopausal wife, whichever one scares you the most. That's who I am to you today. Okay? All right. Oh, we're through. There you go.
All right. I think whoever suggested that we facilitate these meetings got the bargain they asked for. All right. Our first presenter. Now, are we going to have our presenters come to the table, I assume?
Well, our first presenters are coming via the web.
Okay.
From other states because of the timing, and then in the afternoon they will be coming to the table because they'll be physically here.
All right. David, do you want to go ahead and introduce our first presenter?
Our first presenter is the author of the paper that you have in your book, Campus Commons. John Emerwar. He's a professor of philosophy at Villanova University and a senior research fellow at the Public Agenda in Philadelphia. He's done a lot of work in this area. What's interesting about what he's done here is he's actually interviewed, and I think if you had the chance to read this, he's talked to faculty and administrators across the country and gotten their views on the opportunities and the issues that come before us. I think you see John over on the screen here. And he shuffled things in his schedules to be able to make it here, and I know that he's excited about really having this discussion with you. So I think the best thing to do, John, is if you just go ahead and start.
Good morning. It's nice to be here. I couldn't hear too much of your conversation, but I did hear the phrase, your mama and your menopausal wife. So I'm not sure what you're talking about, but I think it's very interesting indeed. So I'm going to talk about what we're calling the fractured conversation. And if you can't hear me, if you're having trouble with the slides, just forgive us. We'll work it out. So, Mayor, if you could go to the next slide, please, where it says today's presentation. Great. So basically what I'm going to do for you today is try to give you the background of the issues you're talking about. That is to say, where the various stakeholders are coming from and what they think about. And by my light, those stakeholder positions are very important because you're not going to be able to get anything done unless you can get all those stakeholders kind of singing off the same sheet. And I'm going to talk about 4 different groups, and we actually have a report on each one at one time or the other, and I think you'll have some of them in your packet, or if not, they're certainly on the website. So first of all, a very important group is college presidents, then the general public, third, state higher education officials, and fourth, a very interesting group that hasn't been studied as much, faculty. So I'll talk about all those in roughly that order. Now, let me give you a warning disclaimer. This is my standard don't shoot the messenger speech. So what I'm talking about is perception. So I can't really tell you the answer to the questions. I'm just telling you what people told me. So if you don't like it, tell somebody else. And in general, if this comes as a huge surprise to you, either there's a problem with my research or you're not really tuned in. So I hope that what I say will sound about right to you, will sound familiar from your own discussion. Now, except for what I say about the public, most of this is based on qualitative research, small number of interviews, focus groups, and so really more in the realm of hypotheses than definitive findings. Let's go to the next slide, and it has 2 bullets. And the work I'm giving you is based on 2 organizations, and if you go to either of their websites, I think you'll find it very interesting. One is Public Agenda, and the second is the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education. Some of you may be familiar with that. That's Pat Callan's group. And again, either of those websites will have a great deal of information for you. And we've really been tracking public opinion since 1993 on higher education. So I'll try and give you some of the trends also. Let's go to the next slide, and again, there are 2 bullets. So let's start with college presidents. And we use the phrase, the iron triangle, to describe what we heard from college presidents. We talked, I think, 30 college presidents in all different sectors. And you know, it's so interesting because we started the interviews by saying, well, we'll just give you a blank canvas and talk for a little bit. And they just started to do our interview anyway. I mean, they answered the questions before we asked them. And basically what they said to us is our lives are about 3 different things. The first, the cost of running our organizations on a day-to-day basis. The second, the challenge of keeping the high educational quality that we have in our organizations. And the third is providing access. So, but that was basically what we were talking about, so we were happy to hear that. Now, what they told us is that those 3 items are, for them, locked in what we called an iron triangle, in a reciprocal relationship. So they would say, you know, you want me to cut my costs? No problem. I can do that very easily, but I can do it in only one of 2 ways. I've either got to do something that will cause my quality to deteriorate or reduce access. You want me to provide more access? Very easy. You've got to give me more money or settle for a cutback in quality. So they almost inevitably saw these 3 things as tightly locked, and you couldn't change one without the other. Let's go to the next slide, please, and it has 6 bullets. So as they talked about the cost, they kind of rehearsed for us the difficulties of being a college president. If you talk to them, I'm sure you'll hear the same thing. But the first thing they said is, we're in a labor-intensive industry. It's all about people. It's all about salaries. It's highly competitive if we're a flagship organization trying to get professors from Harvard and so on. And that costs a lot of money. And you might say our people are overpaid, but if you compare them to jobs, you know, if you look at an economist that works for the higher education or a management consultant, they're probably making more in the private sector. And they also reminded us, as everyone else does, about healthcare costs, which are as serious for them as for everybody else. But they also talked about what you might call is increased demand for services. So everywhere you go in higher education, it seems as though everybody wants more. So one college president talked to us about what he called the sauna war. Now, if you want to attract top students to a high-quality institution, you need to have not just a gym, but saunas. Somebody told me that there are 17 universities now with a lazy river. I wasn't actually sure what a lazy river is, but I understand it's kind of a river where you can float, an artificial river where you can float in your tube, you know, through a concrete river. Now, that doesn't sound so much like higher education, but that's kind of, if you want to attract quality students and all that, you really need to do those things. I'm a university professor. I always take people who come visit here to the student cafeteria. There's a walk station, a salad bar. They say, when I was a student, the food was like the Army. Now, it's wonderful. So all those demands, and again, you have more people with learning disabilities, more people with emotional problems, people who are on medication, especially since Virginia Tech, more demands for security. So it's a very intense barrage of items. Secondly, college presidents, thirdly, and fourthly, whatever I'm up to, college presidents will tell you that this is the one industry where technology doesn't really produce efficiency. So everybody wants a computer, everybody wants to be able to do video conferences, but it hasn't reduced the expenses of teaching. It might have helped us in administration. And you will hear enormous complaints about underprepared students as we draw on a more diverse student pool. Their preparation is uneven, which costs more for remedial classes and support services, and so on. And the college presidents, of course, are quite frank about the reality of university governance. It's like steering the Titanic. You have to get your people to agree to things. They won't agree, and so on. So that's their problem as they see it. Next slide, please. And this has 2 bullets. And at the same time, they will tell you that many states are either decreasing their financial support, or at any rate, the financial support isn't keeping up with their growing costs. And you'll hear a lot about how states are increasingly demanding more and more accountability, and then the college presidents will say, and so I have a room full of accountants trying to keep up with all of my demands for accountability. Next slide, please, and 3 bullets. So you say, well, really, we have to educate more people in this country, and there's not going to be a lot more money for you in the near future. Can't you be more productive and more efficient? And many of the college presidents I talked to said, yes, of course. Greater efficiencies are possible. We're doing our best. But the savings that we can produce will be only incremental. And somebody said, yeah, maybe I can do 5% a year. Sure. But that's not going to make up for my growing expenses or decreasing revenue. And, of course, I'll need more corporate, more philanthropic support, and I'm working on that. But none of that's going to help. Next slide, please, with 3 bullets. So what are we going to do? So the college president said, realistically, there's only one solution. We need to have a different way of thinking about higher education. We need to think of higher education as a public good, not as a private good. In other words, up till now, people have been thinking about higher education as something for students. What's the cost of the tuition? That's fine, but we need to think about how we need higher education in this state. It will bring in more tax revenue. It will bring in more industry. It's something we should all care about. It will produce greater revenue than it costs, and so we need a major reinvestment of public resources into higher education. So that's kind of what I think you will hear from a lot of college presidents. Now let's go to the public with 5 themes. And I'm going to give you 5 themes in public opinion. And again, we've been tracking these, as I said, for many years, and I'm pretty confident about these. And they are, as you see, first, the growing importance of higher education, the threat to access, what we're calling squeeze play, with the public caught in the middle, a theme we're calling the bloom is off the rose, a little Shakespeare here, and what the public wants to do about all this. So let's click through those, and let's start with 2 bullets, please, on growing importance. Next slide, please. So for many years, we tracked the question of whether higher education is important, and by 2003, we're getting 87% said a higher education degree is important. Well, once you get to 87%, it doesn't really matter. The next 10% probably didn't even understand the question or something like that. So we even stopped tracking that. But if you look down, a second more interesting thing that has really intrigued us. As little as 10 years ago, when we were talking to people, we said, is it possible to succeed without a college education? And people said, sure, college education is important, but only about a third said you can't succeed without it. And we heard a lot of stories about Bill Gates, who has $1 gazillion and is a college graduate. So people said, if you're smart and clever, there are many things you can do to succeed. Now look how dramatically that has increased in 8 years. I mean, it's almost doubled. And that really shows you that college has become not just important, but necessary. People say you can't even get the interview anymore for a job that doesn't require a higher education without that college degree. So it has become more and more essential, right? So go to the next slide, please. Now, and that's got 2 bullets. And now this, at precisely the same time that people are saying a college degree is kind of the entry ticket to a decent job and a middle-class lifestyle, people are really seeing access to higher education as increasingly threatened. So, for example, take a look at these things on college costs. So people say college costs are going up faster than other things. So, that's almost 2/3 of the public saying that. College costs are even going up as fast or faster than health care. So people think these college costs are kind of going through the roof. And typically the pattern has been that when the economy is weak and the state revenues are weak, then the universities raise their prices even more, which panics people even more. Next slide, please. And that's got 5 bullets, actually. And so what you're seeing is a dramatic increase in the number of people who say that many qualified students don't have an opportunity for a higher education. Now look at this trend here. back in 1993, remember we were still recovering from a recession then. You had 60% of the public saying many qualified students don't have the opportunity for a higher education. So in the go-go years of the 90s, that dropped way down to 45%. Now going up to 57%, even in the relatively good times in 2003, 62% in 2007. That was when Henry Paulson was still saying the good times would roll on forever, and then jumping up even more in the beginning of this current recession. So people are panicked. Higher education more important and less available. Next slide, please, and 3 bullets. So this brings us to what we call the higher education squeeze play. I sometimes call this the higher education misery index. So the question is, how many people think that college is essential and yet many can't go? So if you look at 2000, all right, quite a few think that higher education is essential, quite a few think that many can't go. But look at those numbers jump up. So 2007, now both sides of the equation are going up. 2008, now both very healthy majorities. And if you look, for example, at any minority population, Hispanic, African American, those numbers are way higher for those groups. So in other words, people are panicked. They're nervous. They really feel like we need this and we can't get it. So we can come back to that in discussion, but I'm telling you that the public is very jumpy about this subject, very nervous about this subject. So far, for reasons I can describe later, this has not caught the same fire as maybe healthcare or something like that, but the tinder is there, it's just waiting for the match. Go to the next slide, please. And this got only just the 1 bullet. So at the same time, traditionally, when we started doing interviews, people felt pretty good about their local higher education institution, and they talked with some pride about it, and they'd gone to the community college, perhaps, and a lot of the problems that people saw in K-12 education, they just weren't seeing in higher education. So even if there was God forbid, a shooting or something like that, it got blamed on outsiders or crazy people, but not like, oh, the schools are out of control, something like that. And professors like myself were seen as kind of harmless eccentrics, driving battered-up old VW Beetles from the 60s or something like that. Now, what's happened, and this is a trend we just started measuring in 2007, very interesting, is people are increasingly saying higher education is just like a business. It cares more about the bottom line than about education. I don't have any evidence for this, but I think part of this is all the advertisement you're seeing now on television and radio for higher education programs. So people are saying it's just one more thing trying to get our money. So look at the growth of these numbers. 2007, 52%. Okay, jumping up to 55% in the beginning of the recession, and now it's 60%. And again, this isn't something about access that's obviously driven by the economy. This is a general attitude about higher education. So, in other words, people are not as sympathetic to higher education as used to be. Go to the next slide, please. It's got 3 bars. So, what does the public want to do about it? Well, the public generally has kind of a very clear idea. What they want you to do is protect access. They don't want to hear that either access is going down or tuitions and fees are going up or programs are closing. And then that's so obvious because they think that access to higher education is essential for a good job, a middle-class lifestyle. Really, it's almost essential for real citizenship in this country. And at the same time, they really don't want to hear about the problems of the colleges and universities. And there's an interesting reason for that. People tend to believe that higher education is something where it's sort of like an obstacle course to students. So it's a time when we see if students can organize their own lives, learn for themselves, and it's really a function of what people bring to the experience rather than what the institution does. So, for example, if you ask people, okay, what happens to a kid who drops out of high school? People will say, it's a death sentence. You say, well, what happens to somebody who drops out of college? They say, well, the student probably not ready. They'll come back later. Whose fault is it if the student drops out of high school? It's the high school's fault. Whose fault is it if the student drops out of college? It's the student's fault or the high school's fault, but not the college's fault. In other words, and again, I'm in higher education. Higher education is the only, if I can call it a business, where people tend to blame the consumer for problems rather than the provider. And so, if the lab instructor doesn't speak English, well, that's a challenge. You have to figure that out. Or if the class is crowded, you need to be more aggressive. So, what we're seeing is pretty good majority saying, 58% saying, colleges could take more students without hurting the quality or price. They're not buying that iron triangle argument. Or 56% saying, colleges could spend less money and still maintain their quality. And only 48% say students are learning more as a result of increasing prices. Next slide, please, the 2 bullets. Now, we talked to a number of people in legislature and government who deal with higher education on the financial side, and we've also, in previous studies, talked to quite a few legislators who deal with higher education. And they have a very clear perspective, many of them. And if you ask them what's their perspective, they say, we need to increase the number of college graduates. First, we need to do that to meet the economic needs of our state. We want to attract industry, we need an educated population, plus these people will have great jobs, all of that. And second of all, it's a great thing for individuals. It's the tradition we saw in the GI Bill, we saw it in the baby boom. It's the way to move people into the middle class. So we need more college graduates. Now go to the next one, just has 1 bullet. Now, when you talk to people about how to do that, and I heard a little bit of echo of this in your discussion earlier, what they'll say is, well, we need to make higher education more productive. We need to focus on, first of all, we need to ask them hard questions. Is it really true that class size in higher education generates more learning? Is it true or is it not true? Is it true of all classes or some classes? We need to do some research, ask questions that haven't been asked. And this second is a huge theme. We need to focus on retention. It's a lot easier to keep students in a higher education institution than it is to get them there if they're not going to go. So we've got to increase our graduation rate. And one of the things we need to do then is incentivize schools to produce more graduates. So I was at what MOA, Making Opportunity Affordable Conference, and people said, in our state, the subsidy for the state institution is done on the census that's done in September and January. Well, we ought to do the census in December and May and see how many, pay them for, not for how many students signed up for the classes and then drop them, but how many students are actually still there. So we need to change the incentive so higher education does a better job in graduating students. And everybody's very excited about technology. Maybe we could have this and that. Maybe people could be talking over the internet like I'm talking to you and all of that. And finally, people are always very keen on dual enrollment, a smoother integration between K-12 and higher education, and maybe it should have been K-6, well, even graduate school, K-20, and people will talk about perhaps we could have dual enrollments with students doing more work in high school, all those things. Next slide, please, and then that's got 4 bullets here. So now I'm going to talk about faculty members, and I did a bunch of faculty members focus groups all over the country, and again, I'm a faculty member, but it was still interesting to hear how clear and how focused they were on certain things. Let me say a little bit first about the realities of life. So years ago, we started talking about something called what you might call a high-discretion workplace. Now, a high-discretion workplace is where the worker can kind of set the pace of what's going to happen. So, for example, somebody's collecting tolls at a toll booth before they're replaced by EasyPass. It's not a real high-discretion workplace. But some areas, workers have very high autonomy. And managers, you can't just tell people what to do or they won't do it. They have to decide to do it themselves. Now, the ultimate high-discretion workplace is higher education. I mean, you're in that classroom, nobody knows what you're doing. You're giving your own grade by and large. So it's kind of up to you what you do, and nobody can make you do whatever. And so the result is that if you want any changes in higher education, they're not going to happen without faculty buy-in. So that's the reality we start with. Next slide, please. Just one bullet. So when we talk to faculty members, we said, what's the major problem that's facing higher education? And they were very clear. The major problem is the students, right? The students, first of all, have poor preparation, and you will hear horror stories. They can't write, they can't read, they can't do this, they can't do that. And also, they have poor attitude. And again, you'll hear a million stories that, for example, people say, students today believe you get grades, you don't earn grades. And they'll say, of course I couldn't take the exam and be here and there because I was going to cheerleading practice, but I need to have an A to maintain my scholarship, and what's your problem? Why can't you understand that? I'm here to get a degree, and so on. So constant complaints about the poor attitudes of students. And also on the other side of the incredible distractions. As you know, many students going to school part-time. These students have to work, have families. And so it's like the complaint about the traditional age students is their attitude and their preparation. The complaint about the non-traditional, they're becoming the traditional students, is often the distractions and also their poor preparation. So you will hear that theme over and over again. Next slide, please. 2 bullets. And then what you will hear is that these unprepared students are dragging down the quality of education. We can't cover as much, we can't do as much, we can't do as much material. We have to kind of dumb everything down to meet where the students are. And the pressure from administration is part of the problem. So they want us to improve access and graduation rates, and they don't want us to give low grades, and they respond to student complaints, and they get student surveys, and the students get mad at us if we give them low grades. And so all of those things make it harder and harder for faculty members to run a quality program. Next slide with 2 bullets, please. And so in contrast to other groups, the faculty members have a completely different definition of the problem. The problem is not that there aren't enough students, that we're not graduating enough students. Many of them would say the problem is we have too many students, too many graduates, too many people who can't do the work being pushed through the system. So in other words, it's exactly the opposite of what you will hear from many people who say the United States needs to educate more people. We're not keeping up with India and China, and our population, the educated population, the older group is the most educated. We've got to keep up all that stuff. They're saying, no. If you want to improve higher education, the solution is not to push more students through the system. We did that in K-12, and look what happened. But to improve the quality of education for students who can do the work. So, again, a completely different framework. Next slide, please, with one bullet. There you go. And so I had a great experience. So I was in, where was I? St. Paul. And there was a conference of state higher education officials and business leaders and people from basic, and I think this, in Texas, you're in the same organization, maybe some of you were there, in this making opportunity, accessible organization. So since I was there, I did a focus group with faculty in the same camp. And so I was at the meeting all day, and then I came to the faculty. And I said to the faculty, among other things, here's some of the ideas they were talking about in the meeting. And I said, for example, let's incentivize colleges for completion of courses or programs. And they said, that's a terrible idea. They said, if you do that, we'll complete more programs and we'll have more students graduate, but it will destroy quality even further. Anything you do to overemphasize retention is going to degrade the quality of education, not improve it. And they said, if you increase class size, we're just going to be able to do fewer papers, fewer projects. We're already overworked trying to keep up with everything. We just can't do it. And I said, well, what about dual enrollment? What about having students take more college classes while they're in high school? And they said, it's not a bad thing for a high school student, but it's a joke as far as, is it really a college class? These community colleges, they said, are teaching classes in the high school, but they're just basically at a high school level, or in some places they're just training the high school teacher to teach the student. So they're not really providing the level of quality that we're looking for. And then I said, well, what about more online education? And you see a room full of rolled eyeballs and groans and so on. They say, well, online education is great. It's very hard work if you're going to do it right. If anything, it's more work than doing a face-to-face class. So it's a fine thing if it's done well, but it's not a magic bullet to solve their problems of productivity. Next slide, please, with 3 bullets. So in other words, they have an entirely different perspective from all the other stakeholders. And they hate the word productivity. So they see, years, 20, 30 years ago, we were doing some work on higher education issues, on workplace issues in industry. And in those days, all the unions said, productivity is a dirty word. If you wanted to make changes in the workplace, you had to say this is to improve the quality of work life. Well, in higher education, among faculty, productivity is a dirty word. It means decreasing quality and making my life miserable. And you want to know what's a really good solution? They say, improve K-12 education. And of course, if you go to K-12, they'll say, well, why don't you, in higher education, send us better teachers and, to train the teachers better. So there you have it. Okay, let's look at the next slide here, and let's look at this little chart. And let me kind of use this to summarize what I've said. So I think you can see between these 4 groups an interesting, what I call the fractured dialogue, with each of them with a different definition of the problem and a different solution. Just to review, so for the college presidents, the definition of the problem is we're caught in the iron triangle between cost, quality, and access. We can't break out of that. And the solution is, well, let's break out of it on the cost side, give us more money. The public says we're caught between growing importance and necessity of higher education and decreasing access, so do whatever you can to protect access. State financial officers and legislators say we need more college graduates. You, higher education, increase productivity and retention. Faculty members are saying we see the problem as deteriorating quality and deteriorating quality of students and declining standards. And what we need you to do is to raise the standards, improve K-12, and stop talking about productivity. Okay, so that gives you a little picture of those groups. So what can I do for you?
Professor, can you hear me?
Just barely, but I can hear you.
Okay. I'm Patty Somerville. I'm facilitating, and I will help facilitate whoever has questions out here and make sure that that's organized for you. Who's got a question?
Great. I hope they don't ask me what to do about this, because I only have only short answers to that.
Okay. Who has questions or comments?
Well, I've got one. I would ask Professor Immerwahr, have you seen any campuses that have broken this fractured dialogue successfully, where faculty has been productively engaged in productivity discussions and planning?
Well, I haven't, although I believe that one of my colleagues, your colleagues in Texas, told me that you've had some pretty good conversations. But I can tell you that faculty members are kind of like rubber duckies. You push them down, but then they'll pop right back up again. So it's going to be a long process, I would say, to get faculty members to really buy into a whole different mindset, partly because as faculty members we always think we know everything more than everybody else. They say there are 2 institutions in this country that can dish it out but can't take it, and one is the media, and the other is faculty members in higher education. So we don't thrive too well with anybody else telling us anything.
Any other questions? Yes, sir. Right.
Have you seen any institutions try to take these 4 different views of the definition of the problem and coalesce them into a more succinct, narrower focused definition of the problem?
Okay, so what you're asking me is really, if I'm understanding you, a political question and a communication question and a public engagement question. So the answer is no, I haven't. But here's how I would attempt to do that. I think you need some sort of public engagement process where you get these various constituencies talking to each other in a kind of controlled and safe environment, so you can get them to come to a similar meeting place. Actually, I think the public is kind of less central to this right away, because I think the public and a lot of state legislators and state financial officers have kind of the same agenda, and I don't think college presidents really deny that agenda. I think everybody would like to see more qualified students going to higher education. But I think to get the legislators, college presidents, and faculty to be in a safe environment where they can let down their defenses a little bit and have a real conversation and come toward a common definition of the problem, I don't think that's happened yet. In the MOA conversations, it was more at the level of business and financial officers and college presidents, but not getting into especially faculty. That's, I think, a group that really has to be incorporated, as I said earlier.
You're welcome. Commissioner.
Have you seen evidence that particularly faculty are more willing to talk about changing academic culture, particularly in the aftermath of what's happening in states like California, where faculty are taking enforced furloughs and taking salary cuts? Has that seemed to suggest to faculty that they might want to be more receptive to changing some of the fundamental cultural qualities of higher education?
Well, first of all, the research we did was now a year or so ago, and so we haven't been back out since then. Let me put it this way. The farther you go down on the feeding chain, the more realistic people are. So community college faculty are the most flexible, the most interested in change, in doing things in a different way. The elite and flagship institutions are the most resistant. So you can assume that the receptiveness to change will kind of work its way up from the bottom. And you know, people are realistic; they'll do whatever they have to do. But the question is, are they really going to rethink the way the core mission is conducted, or are they going to kind of drag their feet and do whatever they have to maintain their salary? You know, this happens over and over again in public life, which is, let me see if I can say it this way. People always want to cut taxes. They never want to cut services. So at one point, the Democratic Party said, well, we should always, when the Republicans say tax cuts, we should always say service cuts. But nobody wants service cuts. Now, you might say, people are stupid. How could they think you could have tax cuts without service cuts? But they do think that, and the reason they think that is they think there's a big slush box right in the middle of waste and fraud and abuse. And so if you cut the taxes, that won't automatically mean you have to cut the services, because you'll just cut the waste. And so likewise, I think many higher education faculty members are very cynical that the administration is bloated, we spend all this money on athletics, and sure, if you get some financial cutback, you'll cut us first, you won't cut the football coach, but it's not done fairly in a way that, I see we need to all pull together. I don't know if that responds to your question, because I don't have the latest data on that, but a couple perspectives.
Yes, ma'am. Lori?
As the only faculty member on this committee, and a faculty member who by trade teaches media, I will tell you that fortunately I checked my pride at the door, but I will tell you that there are those of us who teach in higher ed who are interested in this paradigm shift that you are speaking of, who care about retention of our students, who would like to have that conversation, but I don't think that conversation is a top-down conversation that's being had in higher ed. I think that what you alluded to in terms of our saying that athletics doesn't get their cuts and therefore we're not willing to talk about it until you talk about it across the board. I think that if change happens, it has to happen at the top, and then we're in agreement in terms of buying into that change. But I think that's a discussion that needs to be had across the board, and I think that if more institutions were honestly willing to do that, you would see that there are more faculty who are interested in that change.
And would you agree, I think there are many faculty members for whom retention is an important issue, and especially for non-traditional students, that they're really concerned that their non-traditional students don't have financial aid and don't have child care and don't have daycare and all of that. So I did not mean to say that no faculty members are interested in retention, but what I meant to say was they see that what their administrations will do to increase retention is just to kind of keep people around. Anyway, so I wanted to qualify. But I agree that that conversation has to be a broad-based conversation. It can't be just we're cutting this and we're cutting that.
Yes, sir.
John, I'm just interested in your research, whether there was any discussion, you mentioned on the college president's piece on the Iron Triangle of the increased demand for services, and whether there was any comments or discussion about more focus or maybe, again, a prioritization of what was most important for academic campuses to deliver, and whether or not the public and or the faculty might be willing to accept some reductions in some of the ancillary things that have been added on as campuses have grown to a more holistic community.
You know, if you talk to people, we did another study of college presidents a couple years ago, and we asked, what has changed? And they said, well, lots of things have changed, but the biggest change is that we are now in a very competitive industry, and we compete with distance ed from all over the country, and everybody it's like an arms race out there. At the top end, people are competing for faculty members, for sports teams, for students, for ratings, competing with private institutions. So it's a it's seen as a very competitive environment. And we've also come to a time when consumers are very demanding. They want everything. If they can't get it here, they're going to get it somewhere else. They know what's available. They check it out on the web. And so, again, I teach in a private school, so we get perhaps a different, maybe a quantum leap up here, but everybody who has a complaint says, I pay X dollars for your tuition and X, and I want something. So it's all well and good to say, let's focus on the core mission. We don't need to have all these things, but you do need to have a lot of them. Like learning disabilities. More students are coming to colleges with learning disabilities, so you got to have a whole staff of people to deal with learning disabilities, which is a great thing. You got to have more handicapped access. You have to have more security, all those things. So you can't tell people very easily to cut those and put the money in the library.
Other questions, comments?
One more.
Jesse?
Perhaps even a suggestion. It would be interesting to have focus groups with students who have dropped out, didn't finish, contrary to what, some believe. I believe there are many students that are capable of doing college work who don't. I believe there are students that can find ways to go to school full-time who don't. And I'm dealing with two right now that have made all the way to my office with 1350 SATs and blazed their way to 3 Fs, a C, and a D. Why can't we get students to go to take 15 hours a semester? What is going on there? Students are capable of doing college work. We all take those into our universities, but many, many of them don't. I'd like to see research like this done with students group. Maybe it'd be more confusing, but perhaps it might enlighten even more. Have you thought about that?
Actually, we did a study for the Gates Foundation of students who have dropped out, and it is just what you said. There are so many pressures and so many distractions on students that make it impossible for them to continue their education. And as the economic situation either worsens or doesn't improve, that makes it harder and harder because people have to work, they can't afford child care, the gas money, family responsibilities. So I think if people want to increase retention, I think that part-time students and non-traditional students is very important. And I will try to send a link to that to that study to Mary, because it really speaks to exactly those questions.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Yes, sir.
Is there anything we can learn from what the rest of the world is doing, like India, China, Japan, some of these countries where they compare their education as being superior to what we're getting in the United States?
Right. Now, here I think Dennis Jones and his colleagues at Menchem can tell you much more than I, because they, I believe, have followed this more closely. Again, the scary thing is, and I alluded to this briefly, that in the United States, the best educated sector of the population is us baby boomers, who are just headed for retirement. And the youthful cohort is less educated in the United States. Whereas in all those other countries that you mentioned, China and India, it's the young cohort is the best educated. So they're putting an enormous amount of energy into educating the young. So that suggests good things for their economy. Now, some people say when you talk to college presidents, some people will say, yeah, but their universities are not really up to the standard of ours, and maybe that's true. But anyway, the big lesson is they're not defining themselves as how educated a population they are, but how educated their young people are. And when we look at it that way, it doesn't look so hot.
Roberto.
In your research, obviously you had to deal with foreign institutions and community colleges. What was the percentage of the community colleges that was represented in your research?
In which one? Well, anyway, there's always, like in the college presidents, I don't have the exact number and I have to fuss around with it, but what we did is we created a panel study, so many community colleges, so many four-year regional, so many flagships. So I think it's about 25% were community colleges, and same for the faculty members. And the faculty groups, I think we ended up doing groups with all community college because it didn't work to mix them up. So we had a healthy representative of community colleges. What's interesting about community colleges is that that's another solution that everybody likes. So all the college presidents will say, well, we need, our students aren't prepared enough, so we need to send the unprepared students to the community colleges and let them, because they're better at that than we are, and so on. And they're more inexpensive to educate people, so we should educate more people in community colleges. But nobody seems to be giving that much more money to the community colleges, at least according to the community colleges. They say we're getting more and more stressed out students to deal with, and no particular support to do so. So it's an interesting politics between the various community sectors.
Bernie?
I think you started off by saying that these were perceptions or perhaps feelings. I was wondering if there is a common regard for a source of facts, and if so, could that be the mechanism to pull these four groups together?
My instinct is that we always think in this country that facts are the answer. We have so many facts. We have so much information out there. I think the need is more, and as your faculty colleague said, who spoke a little bit, is more for trust. And trust in others, and not more facts, but hearing the other, conversations, dialogue, trust, those kind of things, more on the emotional level. We always have the instinct if we could just get the facts out, then that would solve everything. But then we just have more facts and people can't follow the facts. So dialogue rather than facts would be my solution.
Other questions or comments?
Let me answer.
Elmo?
I do have a question. I'm at a health science center, and I realize many of our operations are different from the general academics that you're principally discussing, but when it comes to accrediting bodies, how did you factor accrediting bodies into these various groups? I realize accrediting bodies are typically a cross-section of many of these four factors, but they do determine our future, especially as it pertains to the public eye and faculty-student ratios, et cetera. So what did you do as far as accrediting bodies and how they relate to these various groups?
Right. So if I heard the question, is how do we factor in the question of accrediting bodies for the various sectors? Yeah, that's a finer level of research than this is. You're talking to a focus group of faculty members for all different institutions, so we tended not to get into that. What we heard in general is, especially from the college presidents, that they were all very concerned, of course, with the demand for accountability from accrediting bodies and everyone else, and they were constantly saying that's a good thing, but voluntary accountability is what we need. We don't need more state government looking over our shoulders. So there's a lot of tension around accountability, but we didn't look specifically into the challenges of different accrediting bodies, although it would be a very interesting thing to do.
Questions? Other questions or comments? It's Lori.
There is a book called College Student Success in which George Koo and his associates looked at 20 of the most effective institutions in the country. Are you familiar with that, and how did that factor into some of the perceptions? Did you find that at some institutions there was this dialogue going on among the four stakeholders that you researched?
Right, and again, George is doing very interesting work. We're at a much more general level of perception than looking at specific institutions. But I think there are some exciting things going on. And as you know, Nessie is also trying to document which institutions do a better job. But this kind of research doesn't really tell you that.
Thank you.
What I've tried to give you is the general political climate that you're struggling with, rather than the specific what's going on in one institution or the other.
More questions or comments? Yes, sir.
Mentioned earlier about a safe place, or somebody mentioned earlier about a safe place for dialogue to be between faculty and the presidents. I wonder if a way to accomplish that, because it seems to me, and I'm not an educator, so I don't know a lot about this, but it seems to me like we have some barriers. And I wonder if faculty from School A meeting with presidents from schools B, C, and D and mix them up there so they're not this linkage within the same institution, you couldn't get some common language here, or common ground.
Exactly. So one of the things we do, we do some public engagement projects. And so what we don't do is go in and say, well, let's talk about your institution right now, because everybody digs in. So we say, and it might be, just as you said, with people from a number of institutions, and we give them more a hypothetical. So we might say, we're hiring a new president, and there are three candidates, and one candidate emphasizes this, and one candidate emphasizes that, and the third so on. And so let people get a little bit out of their daily, who's going to lose the money on this, and then it is interesting that they more frequently find commonality and common interest. So I think those kind of trust-building exercises where you remove people from their daily situation are actually the way to go. I mean, it would be complicated to do that on large scale, but we could certainly talk about how to do that in another time. But your instinct is exactly right.
Other questions or comments? Professor, I believe they have run out of questions. Do you have anything
nice
else?
working with you, and you have my email. If anything comes up, let me know, and I'll try and send that link to that Gates study about the dropouts and all that.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, nice talking to you.
Would you guys like a break? 11:20, I believe, is the time that Jane Wellman is to come on. If y'all would like a break, I'd like you to do two things. Obviously, take the break. But two, if there is any idea that has come up, please record it so that we can use it later in the day.
Let me add that Jane is available to start before 11:20.
I'm here now.
Do you
Talk
need
about real time.
Yeah. Do you need a break?
Y'all want to go ahead and move ahead, or do we want to take a break?
Move ahead. Take a break.
And let me say this, that protocol here is intended to be somewhat informal, so if you need to use the restrooms or you want to grab a bottle of water or a cup of coffee, just get up during the meeting and do that. Nobody's chained at the ankle here. I think one thing, I think we should go ahead and let Jane do her presentation, but I did want to ask one general comment of the group here, and that is, were any of you from your respective backgrounds and roles surprised by the the four different points of view and the dichotomy there? Was that what you would have expected, or is it a little bit of a surprise? I see Laurie's nodding her head that that's what she would have expected.
It's like the blind man and the elephant.
Fred, I think it was the best summary of what I've observed in all of my roles in higher education I've ever seen. There was nothing in there that I would not expect. Many things I do believe and see as a problem. I think it's a great summary.
And that's a good point. It for me, too, it brought these different viewpoints together in the most succinct, to-the-point format that I've ever seen, as opposed to the anecdotal stories and the different points of view we all bring to the table. So
It certainly defines the philosophical issue.
And I didn't want anybody here to think our work was going to be easy. So now we've laid the groundwork for the challenge, I think, in front of us.
Well, Fred, at our place, this presentation personifies what we're going through right now. We're trying to do the best to be as efficient as possible and consolidate services and things of that nature. And the faculty just gave our chancellor a vote of no confidence. So this is real. This is a challenge that we're going to have as this committee goes forward. Because when you talk about efficiencies, people are not listening to the word efficiency. They're looking at budget cuts, but cutting service, flash words like that. So this is a very real issue. And this fractured dialogue is there. It may look a little different for community colleges and the four-year institutions, but it's there.
So in Texas, we're not necessarily in this body of national research. We see these same disputes. We might like to think we're a little further down the road, but perhaps not. I also should have mentioned earlier that we do have bios for our presenters in your black portfolios that you got with all the papers in them. And unless anybody has anything else, I think, Patty, we can go ahead with Jane Wellman is Executive Director of the Delta Project on Post-Secondary Education Costs, Productivity, and Accountability. I'm not going to read her bio to you, but it is in your packet, and she's going to talk to us about trends in college spending.
And Jane, this is Patty Somerville. I will ring a bell at the 2-minute, as a 2-minute warning.
Okay.
So you'll know that your time is almost up. Okay?
All right.
Thank you.
Well, do you want me to take it away here?
Please.
All right. I'm glad to be with you in this, the virtual sense anyway, and have an opportunity to present some of our findings and work we've done on college costs, trends in college spending, where the money comes from, where the money goes. I believe you all have a hard copy of this presentation and that it's also being shown to you in the room. Is that right?
Yes.
I can't see your heads nodding, but I imagine that's what you're doing. All right, well, let me move through this fairly quickly. What I'm going to talk about here are national top-line trends and metrics that we have assembled using national data to try and bring some better factual basis for public conversations about patterns of higher education finance. We started this work a few years ago, largely supported with grant resources from the Lumina Foundation. And one of our priorities with the work has been to try and bring better language and clearer metrics
to bear to conversations about college finance, where the money comes from, where the money goes, what it buys. As your prior conversation clearly shows, and as you all live with every day, this is a topic where perceptions about the college finance are frequently at odds with the realities of college finance, and that happens in all kinds of ways, beginning with the fact that there is such a huge, vast landscape of types of institutions in higher education. And what is true about the characteristics of one type of institution, or perhaps even a sector of higher education, may not have anything to do with the realities of funding in different kinds of institutions. So trying to put some numbers around this data and put it in a language that's more publicly accessible has been a priority for us. What I'm going to review with you is a report we published almost a year ago. We'll have an updated version of it in another couple of months that will bring data up into 2008. The nature of this type of data, looking at expenditure data, is that it is somewhat out of date, and so it's not going to be as current as we might like it to be, but it's much more current than what we typically have had in the past. Quickly, I'm going to move through the slides, beginning with the metrics. The focus is on spending, and by spending we're talking about costs, or what it costs an institution in operating resources to function, not prices. As you know, most of the conversation about college costs is about tuition and not about spending, but we're more interested in where the money goes. We do talk about price somewhat and a focus on net tuition revenue. We've looked at data for spending and revenue trends over time, beginning with 1987, going through 2006, using public data adjusted for changes that have occurred over this time in reporting categories. Public and private institutions report under different accounting standards, and I guess I'm not sure. I'm having people fiddle with the camera. Sorry about that. Not that I want to see myself. Please don't make me do that. Data are put into FTE spending and revenues per FTE student. We've adjusted spending and revenue trends for inflation using the CPI. We could do it different ways. We can talk about that. For the national metrics, we've organized this into the major Carnegie categories, distinguishing between public and private, research, masters, and community colleges. And all the data that are presented here use a consistent panel or sample of institutions so that we know that changes over time are not attributable to who's dropped in or out of the funding sample. The sample is fairly robust. It's about 2,000 institutions. We think we have about 80% or more of the institutional enrollments in higher education. Almost all of the public four-year institutions, about 800 of the public community colleges around the country, and about 800 private four-year institutions. So it's not the universe, but it's a very healthy sample. Next slide, please. Very briefly, want to note that it's important in looking at spending patterns and revenue patterns to put the data into the context of enrollments and what's happened to enrollments over this period of time. I know you're familiar with this. I won't belabor it. You're certainly familiar with the situation in Texas, but it is important for public audiences to remind them that this has been a period of unprecedented enrollment growth in higher education in this decade, a much greater level of growth in enrollment than we'd seen in the prior 2 decades combined. Most of that has been from students of color, and so you can see what those numbers look like at a national level. The demographic changes are even more vivid, I know, in Texas institutions. The next chart, if you can go to the next page, one of the things that has happened everywhere in the country are you going to chart 4? if you could. There's been a real shift of market share over this period of the 2000s, in which there has been a relative decline in the proportion of enrollments that are being served among public institutions. This has happened pretty much everywhere in the country, with the biggest decline in the public research institutions. The shift has occurred to private institutions. The winners, if you will, in this have been the private comprehensive or master's institutions, and then the for-profit sector, which has had substantially greater growth than elsewhere. This is a relative shift. All institutions, all sectors most institutions and sectors have seen overall growth in enrollment, but the market share going to public institutions has declined. Any questions on this before I jump off of enrollments? I want to move through the funding patterns fairly quickly. I think it's, let me say when we go to the next slide 5, I believe these metrics are probably, the patterns here are as important for your consideration as they affect the metrics that you use or think about using in your conversations about college costs, as much as for the numbers. As I say, this will be a national presentation, but you can imagine as I walk through this what this might look like in Texas, and we could prepare a presentation modeled after these metrics, looking only at Texas institutions or focusing on Texas public institutions. We snapshot data into 6 big buckets, beginning with where the money comes from, revenue sources and levels, going to where the money goes, how it gets spent. Third, looking at the relationship between spending and increases or decreases in spending relative to tuitions, and trying to look at the interaction between costs and tuitions. Fourth, we look at the cost subsidy pictures. I'm going to decode all of this as we move through this, to look at the patterns of what it costs in higher education and who's paying for it, and the relative share of costs coming from states or from institutions versus the student share of cost. Fifth, what the money buys in terms of spending per degree produced. And sixth, where the money is versus where the student enrollments are, sort of an aggregate meta-level comparison. Slide 6 goes into a little bit of detail about why we chose these metrics, and we can come back on this. I would recommend we hold this to a discussion part of the conversation. Suffice to say, the metrics are ones, we didn't entirely invent these. They derive from the literature on cost and cost analysis. It represents a pretty solid consensus among the analysts of cost that this is as decent a way to present costs as one can. And we've also tried to organize them to reach to what we think are the types of policy questions that decision makers, whether they're at a state legislative level or a board level or even inside an institution, need to make about where they can get the money, where the money goes, and the relationship between spending and tuition. There are also metrics that can be used, most important for this conversation. You can roll them up to different levels of aggregation. So you can use these to, for instance, look at what spending might look like across Texas institutions only, or you could do Texas compared to other states. One can use this to look at institutional level patterns. So they are ones that allow different lenses depending on what the unit of analysis needs to be. Let's go now to slide 7, which is metric 1, snapshot trends in revenue per FTE. All these charts are organized pretty much the same way, which is that you begin on the far left with the public research sector, followed by public master's institutions and community colleges, followed by the private research institutions, master's and bachelor's institutions. What we've done in this chart is to roll the money into several big buckets, beginning with the bottom piece of it, the blue piece, which is net tuition revenue. The red piece is state and local appropriations. The little green sliver for the publics, not for the privates, is money coming from private gifts and return on investments. The purple line is federal appropriations, contracts and grants. That tends to be a surrogate for organized research and sponsored activities. And then the top blue line, the teal line, is auxiliary enterprises, self-supporting operations, including dormitories and hospitals. You can see what these patterns show, which a couple of things. One is the significant difference in access to overall revenues depending on sector. The second one has to do with the role of private revenues, particularly growth in tuition revenues, as a share of resources. This has occurred both in public and private institutions, although most dramatically in public institutions. The third comment I would make has to do with what we would call the green money part of this, which is essentially the bottom couple of lines, the net tuition revenue and state and local appropriations for public institutions. And to make the point that the amount of revenue that's available for general purposes is significantly less than what the top line might indicate. And mind you, this is only for operating revenues. We're not even talking about capital. So we think snapshotting the revenue to distinguish what the major sources are and to show how much of this is coming from resources that are flexible is an important part of this conversation. One last comment I'll make on this slide has to do with what you see in the private institutions and patterns as contrasted to the public institutions. In the public institutions from 2002 through 2006, actual spending, particularly total revenues, particularly the red and blue parts of this, have been relatively flat. So actual revenues are not going up that dramatically, despite a shift in the sources of revenue. That's not the case in the private institution, where there's been a fairly explosive growth in revenues, particularly in the private research institutions in the last part of the 2000s, largely attributable to the growth in investment returns. Any questions on this before we jump off this slide? Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Number 8, where the money goes. What we've done in these metrics is to cluster spending using a couple of different metrics. The first is to snapshot the proportion of spending that is going for what we call education and related resources, which is pretty much everything but sponsored research and auxiliary enterprises. So E&R is instruction, student services, and general support for those. Education in general is education and E&R plus sponsored research, and then total operating, which includes auxiliaries. If you look at the next slide, number 9, you'll see what this means, which is a different snapshot looking at spending rather than revenues. You see the same kinds of patterns, which shows that the amount of money, the blue line here, is the amount that is going for what we call education and related expenses. That's sometimes called the full cost of instruction, for those of you who are into that lingo. And you see here that in the publics, the blue part of this, the amount of money that is going to education and related expenses has been relatively flat. Actual costs have not gone up that much. Where there has been increases in spending in public institutions, it's tended to be in sponsored research, and that has not occurred uniformly across all types of institutions. So costs in the public institutions are relatively flat. Not so the case in the privates, where there's been a greater level of increase in spending, but even among private institutions, it's been heavily located inside the private research universities. Any comments or questions before we move on? The next chart, number 10, what we've done in this one is to peel the onion a little bit to look inside the bar of education and related expenses that would have been the blue line in the last chart, to look at the proportion of spending inside of that that is going to pay for the direct cost of instruction, which is basically faculty salaries, versus the amount that is going to pay for student services, versus the amount that is going to pay for institutional support, administration, and maintenance. What you see in here, the patterns are pretty clear. The proportion of spending going to pay for the direct cost of instruction, the blue piece of this, is down relative to the slight increases in spending in the other pieces. It's not occurring in student services or instruction. Where there have been increases, it's occurred primarily in the other categories of academic support, institutional support, and maintenance. Again, I want to reiterate, these are not at the national level dramatic increases. Nonetheless, there has been a trend over time that the instructional share of spending as a proportion of expenditures is modestly declining. Next chart. This is the same set of numbers for the privates. And you see that with the exception of the private research universities, the same pattern of the instructional share of spending going down modestly has also occurred in private institutions. You can also, if you put these next to one another, see that the share of spending among private institutions that's going for student services but also for institutional and other support is substantially higher than in public institutions. Okay, we're going to shift off this next, the spending to look at the third metric, which is the relationship between tuition increases and spending, to try and tease out the proportion of tuition increases that can be attributed to actual increases in spending rather than to cost shifts. What we've done here is essentially a what-if analysis, looking at what's happened to changes in sticker prices compared to spending for education and general resources to test if tuitions had gone up only enough to pay for actual increases in spending, what would that have been? And how does that compare to what they were? I hope this makes some sense. If you go to the next slide, you'll see how the numbers work out, which is that I'll use the public research sector just as a way to make to explain the metrics here. Education and related spending per student in public research universities increased over this period of time by about 2.5%. Slight increase, not dramatic, over a period of 4 years. At the same time, in-state tuition for undergraduates, the classic sticker price went up almost 30%. If tuition had gone up only enough to pay for the spending increase, it would have gone up only 8.4%. So if you look at those, compare those two numbers, that tells you what proportion had tuitions only gone up enough to pay for increases in spending, they would have only gone up 8%. For public masters and public community colleges nationwide, overall spending on education in general during this time actually declined, despite significant increases in tuition. So we said that none of the tuition increases were caused by increased spending. They all went to cost shifting or to backfill for losses in state revenues. The next slide snapshots the same metrics for private institutions. Very different picture on slide 14 for privates. Again, with the private research universities as an outlier. The one place in higher education where tuition increases actually paid for significant increases in, or not increases in spending. In private master's and bachelor's institutions, despite increases in tuition, relatively little of that made it to the bottom line. very different reasons for this inside private institutions and public institutions. Inside private institutions, most of the disparity between tuition increases and spending increases is attributable to the growth in tuition discounting that occurred in private institutions. The next slide, 15, recaps some of what we just talked about. In public research universities, just 8% of the tuition increases over this period actually paid for increased spending. None in the public masters and community colleges. Private research universities, almost all, 72% of the tuition increases went to pay for greater spending. Just 12 and 15% in the other parts of private institutions. Any questions on this one before we jump off? I'm sure all of this is either boring or terribly complicated, but we'll just jump over it so we can come back and talk about it. Slide 16 now. Shifts in cost, price, and subsidy. And what we've looked at here is the proportion of education-related costs that are paid by students versus those that are paid by the state. We're looking here at the E&R share again, what the average cost per student is, how much of that's paid from net tuition revenues, how much of it from subsidy share. If you go to slide 17, I think these numbers speak for themselves. Just let me run through them quickly for the public research sector. Total spending per student between 2002 and 2006 was almost flat, whereas in 2002, the state share, the average subsidy share per student was $83.48. By 2006, that had declined per student by almost $1,300, nationwide average from $83.48 down to $70.78, in contrast to the share of costs that are coming from student tuition, going from net tuition revenue $53.22 to $67.41. And you can see the comparable shift in subsidies that have occurred in master's institutions and community colleges. There's been less increase in net tuition revenue in community colleges over this period, although they also suffered significant drops in subsidies. The fact that community colleges were the least able to replace lost state revenues with tuition increases is the reason why you see steeper funding cuts nationally in community colleges than is the case elsewhere. Next slide shows the same thing. The next slide just restates what's in the bar graphs in numbers so that you can look at those numbers if you care to. And then the next two slides, 19 and 20, restate the numbers for the private institutions, and you can see again the real pretty vivid differences. We're almost done. We've got two more metrics. One on slide 21. We look at spending per completion. This is a metric that gets as close as we can with available data to some aggregate measures of cost per degree production. This is a highly aggregated measure looking at total spending against total degree and credential production. This is a different number than we typically see inside higher education. It's not the completions figures are not a measure of time to degree or graduation rates. What they are is a measure of degree produced per 100 students enrolled. So it's not a typical metric. It's not an ideal metric, but it's one that does get a little bit of a snapshot of some measure of cost per degree production. On page 21, you see what the national data look like in terms of total degrees produced per 100 FTE students enrolled. On the left side, we have degree production. On the right side, total completions. The difference between the two is most important for community colleges, where there's a significant number of students who get some form of a credential or a certificate, but not a degree. If you look just at degree produced per 100 students in community colleges, you'll see a much lower figure because so many of the students are not in degree programs, as well as many of them leave the institution without getting a degree. But if if you look at total completions for community colleges, their figures or their level of degree productivity per spending is pretty close to what you would see in other types of institutions. Slide 22 goes into definitions for these categories. For those of you who want to decode this again. And then on page 23, we've snapshotted what the spending looks like over time, aggregate spending against degree production. And what this shows in very short summary is that the two things. One is that spending against degrees has actually increased just slightly in most institutions, but has declined rather significantly in community colleges. Between 2002 and 2005, across most of higher education, in public higher education, spending against degree production and spending has increased. Productivity has increased. So if this is used as a measure of cost effectiveness or cost efficiency, for this period of time you could make the case that higher education is becoming more efficient. Not so the case in private institutions, particularly in the private research sector. Last slide, page 24. What we've done here is to roll up data on student enrollments versus spending, to snapshot where the students are enrolled, which is the blue line here, at a national level, compared to average spending for education and related spending only. That excludes all research spending. Spending per student on average compared to where the enrollments are. And I think this graph kind of speaks for itself. If you look at this over time, the degree of stratification, if you will, in terms of enrollment growth being most heavily concentrated on the right side of the graph, in contrast to spending growth being most heavily concentrated on the left side of the graph. So the level of the differences across higher education are enormous. The averages, and speaking about this in averages is really quite misleading. The majority of the enrollments are in institutions that have less than $10,000 per student to invest per year. This is the type of thing that helps to address some of the issues of public perception. Page 25 is a recap. I won't belabor all of that. You can see what it says. In the last couple of slides, we've taken some of the top-line findings and translated them to what they look like using these metrics for Texas public institutions. The slide that's on, I don't know that we have a page number here, but I think it's up on your you can see it now, which is the shift of the subsidy share of costs in Texas between 2002 and 2006. Quite mirrors the national patterns that you saw before, with actual declines in spending in Texas, except with a slight exception of the public bachelor's institutions, which are very slightly increased, but a significant shift in the proportion of spending that is being paid for by the state versus the amount being paid by the student. And then the very last slide snapshots some of the other spending metrics in terms of education and related costs per FTE, the student share of costs, and then aggregate spending for degrees and completions. So we'll stop there. I know this is an awful lot of stuff to throw at you. We can have a general conversation about these metrics and what they do or don't show, and particularly how they might be useful to you as you proceed with your work.
Are there any brief questions or comments from the audience?
Patty, Jan, I'd like to ask, with the nearness of the report update coming out, have you gotten familiar enough with the 2008 data to know, are there any major trend changes, either in reversing the trend or in further steepening the incline or decline?
The 2008 data is going to show what we typically see in higher education, which is there was an uptick in state resources between 2006 and 2008. So there's a slight reversal, softening, I guess I would say, of the trends of declining state share, but not dramatic, and certainly not enough to return to the patterns that we saw in the 90s of state share of subsidies. The proportion of spending going for instruction and the modest but steady decline continues. So the short answer is nothing dramatic happened between 2006 and 2008. Slight rebounding of state resources, not dramatic. Student share of costs stayed roughly the same, but total spending per student did not go up dramatically during this period. The subsidies shifted back a little bit. Spending didn't jump up that much.
Anything else?
What is your takeaway when you compare the public to the private and what they're spending per student?
Privates have more. Generalizations about the privates are about as bad as they are about the public. There's huge differences between the private research universities, and even in that sector, there are some institutions like DePaul, which I think is classified as a research university, that doesn't look very much like Harvard and Yale. So the disparities between the institutions that are at the top of the Ivy League food chain and the institutions that are living in the Midwest or the South are huge. I think the private institution, all institutions operate in a competitive environment. You see the effect of competition in privates fairly vividly looking at these numbers over time. I think it is the case, and a lot of research has shown this, that competition in higher education tends to increase spending, not to decrease it. And you see it most vividly in the private institutions in competition for tuition and tuition discounting and the proportion of cost that is going to pay for enrollment management. But the difference between the private research universities and the bar that is set by them and everybody else in higher education is really very vivid. The short story on all of this is that in the last decade, the rich got richer, the poor got poorer, and the gaps between the hyper-rich institutions and pretty much everybody else got bigger. I think it's fair to say, and I think Emma War's research certainly shows this, public perceptions about spending in higher education are driven very heavily by the perceptions of spending and revenue availability in the more selective elite institutions and primarily the private institutions. Even in states like Texas or California that have very dominant public institutions, the mental picture that people carry around with them about higher education is heavily dominated by a relatively small sector of institutions. And if you look at that graph on page 6, they enroll the lowest overall proportion of students, and yet they have a significant advantage in revenue availability.
Any other questions?
I've got one more. Do you have similar graphs that or study that show the spending per graduate trends in research spending and in auxiliary spending?
We could do it. We didn't do that. We tried to focus on the education and related expenditures because we think that's the better metric when it goes to pay for instructional expenses. Now, in as you know, in all institutions, that figure includes the proportion of faculty salaries that go to pay for instructional research, or departmental research. And so there is a portion of that spending that is attributable to the amount of research that is done that is not paid for with contract and grant revenues. So you could look at total spending against degrees produced that would include auxiliaries and would include research. Just looking at these graphs, you can imagine what it would do. It would push the numbers up more. I don't know that it would be a better way to do it.
Okay. Jane, thank you very much for your participation. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Good luck to you with your work.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Fred has said that what we would like to do is slip in Gary's presentation prior to lunch, who is brimming over and needs to go take a brief break. Can we do that? I think it will give us more time for discussion this afternoon, and that would be great. If you need an individual break, please take one. So this is on your agenda for 1 o'clock.
That's all right.
This was report that I think Gary will be speaking to. That was in. I don't know. Did we put this in the black portfolios? I know it was in the notebooks that were handed out at our last. Okay.
Should be in there. Let me go ahead to the next slide. Before I talk about the survey, I'd like to, I guess this kind of builds on what Jane was showing. We have done sources and uses studies in Texas for a number of years, and those of you that are familiar with our financial reports that we put out in coordinating board, we've done a sources and uses for general academic, health related, and we've done some cost studies for cost reports for community colleges for a number of years. And before I get into the survey results, I wanted to kind of show you where our sources and uses shows the largest cost increases in Texas. And I think this relates directly to what our survey results were, in that a lot of the survey, a lot of the items that were submitted by the institutions as actions that they've taken on cost efficiencies already deal with some of these areas where we're having the highest costs. The first slide here deals with university support. We're seeing, and these are in actual dollars. I know most of Jane's slides were in inflation-adjusted dollars, but I'm looking, this is actual dollars without inflation adjustment. Between 2003 and 2008 in universities, general academic universities, instruction and research went up about 30% in actual dollars. But if you look at what student services, academic support, and operation and maintenance costs increases have been, some of them are double that rate of increase.
Gary, would you define the difference between student services and academic support?
Yes, student services primarily is your guidance counselors, your advising. It's your enrollment management, which means both financial aid and your registrar and your recruiting costs. That's your student services primarily. The academic support, I guess the largest thing that IPEDS usually separates out of academic support is the expenditures on library. But more and more academic support, I think we're seeing, your tutoring centers and the other support costs for the outside the library is falling into the academic support area, and that is where we're seeing our biggest increases, where they have tutoring centers for specific disciplines such as sciences and mathematics and writing. Those costs are falling into the academic support. And then operation and maintenance of your plant is really separated two things. You're maintaining the buildings and the grounds, and then you're paying for the utilities for the operation of those buildings.
Just a quick question. Would there be a lot of, in this time period, a lot of investment in technology when you talk about libraries and stuff like that? Would that be a lot of that increase in cost?
There has been a shift from the printed versions to instructional materials that are either subscribed to or licensed in the libraries and in the instructional areas. So I think that is, and with that, your libraries may not have as many printed editions of books as they've maybe doubled or tripled the number of computers that they've had to install in libraries. The community colleges is the next slide, and here this is the same thing has happened in that instruction has been about what inflation rate has been for these 5-6 years, but academic support, student services, operation of the plant, and institutional support have exceeded the growth in instructional costs. Health-related institution is the next one, and
Gary,
yes.
What do you mean by institutional support? That's a different, an added category for the community colleges.
Institutional support is in the community colleges is the administration. It is both your chief executive officer, chief academic officer, those offices, chief business officers, as well as expenditures on security and your overall technology of the institution. Most institutions report whoever runs the IT department is under institutional support. There may be instructional IT costs, but then there's an overall administrative cost for IT that supports the whole campus function.
And is this broken out for community colleges because the 4 years in the health-related don't break it out that way? Or
they still break it out that way, but they weren't significantly higher than the instructional costs.
It's on here because it was a noted trend that wasn't in the other two.
It was not in the other two. Under health-related, although in student services you see is a small bar, it's a small item on there, but it has seen a 50% increase in the health-related institution. Academic support and operation of the plant at the health-related institutions have significantly increases, and I want to point out that we did not have this information for 2003 and 4, so I'm comparing 2005 to 2008 for the health-related institutions. So it's even been a more dramatic change in those two categories. Any questions about those? I think also you received in your packet 12 pages of charts that deal with the cost changes in higher education in Texas from 2003 to 2008. And I do want to point out that we have included in there, similar to what I think Jane did, is cost per FTSE, which takes into account the growth as well as just the total cost. And if you have time to look through those charts, you'll see that if you look at the cost per FTSE and the cost per degree in actual dollars, growth in Texas costs have been less than the inflation rates during those times. So part of the cost increases are related to growth in enrollment numbers as well as degrees awarded. One of them in there I want to mention is the health-related institutions. If you look at their cost per degree in actual dollars, has actually gone down in the last 4 years. Talking about the cost efficiency survey that we did. This was a quick survey that we did prior to the December 3rd meeting of this committee, in conjunction with the formula advisory committees that met this fall. We asked them 3 questions. What have you done to improve efficiency? How much were the savings, and for what time period are those savings accounted for? And what was the impact to the institutions and the students? We received 66 responses, 17 from community colleges. Each one of those were 1 per college. We received 33 from the universities. That was from 22 institutions. And 16 from health-related institutions, and that was all 9 health-related institutions responded. The calculated savings, you can see there. I do want to mention that there's been I found one mistake today in talking to one of the health-related institutions in the way we calculated their savings, and I'll correct them on this slide. You have $35 million as the estimated savings. The corrected amount is $27.7 million. And the next slide, I wanted to tell you, cover some of the items that were submitted. Shared services is a developing item that I think all of the university systems are starting to address. From the University of Texas, which you, in the summary, that you have some details about the University of Texas shared service. Texas A&M has talked to us about what they're doing in shared services. UNT also and University of Houston have all submitted information to us about their shared services for payroll, purchasing, and fiscal resources. And I think that is something that will be expanding. Some of them have just started. Some of them are 3 or 4 years into this process. But I think that will be a continuing effort on those institutions to share resources, centralize services that are such as purchasing, payroll, and fiscal responsibilities as they can. Many of the community colleges submitted energy efficiency projects. Some of those we didn't know about since a lot of the projects that we receive are from the general academic and the health-related institutions. We don't see, the coordinating board doesn't see what the community colleges are doing year to year on energy savings projects, but we did summarize some of those projects in that summary. Many of the schools talked about their bulk purchases that they're making, as well as setting up purchasing co-ops among themselves, among their institutions in the system. Some of the community colleges participate in bulk purchases with school districts so that they can increase their purchasing power. One of the larger submitted items had to do with reviewing staffing needs in one of the health-related institutions. Talked about a process that they have implemented to align their facility, their needs of their institution to the staffing needs, and the review process that they have implemented has significantly increased their savings in operations. And we will be continuing this survey. We've asked the institutions that did not respond to submit additional responses, and we've also received some comments back from some of the institutions that they have additional things that were not submitted.
Any questions for Gary? Mike?
In part of the reporting and trying to understand numbers, there's always seems to be a lack of clarity and definition for administration or for institutional support or academic support. For instance, is a dean who is a tenured professor show up under academic, under teaching, or does she show up under institutional support, which I will look at as an administrative expense? When, we have to report what our administrative load is, and it just seems that we're lacking some clarity and definitions of what counts as administration and what counts as academic.
There is we go by the NACUBO definitions, and I do agree with you that they are not crystal clear. And but typically in the academic support, you're looking at the departmental administration of the.
We're sorry, your conference is ending now. Please hang up.
There has the academic administration at the department level and the college level is typically in the academic support area. If you look at NACUBO definitions, your campus-wide academic officers, your provost and your vice president of instruction, those are typically in the institutional support area of most of the in those definitions. But it's not clear, and I know depending on the size of the institutions, there may not be a clear definition as to clear-cut assignment of where that effort is, whether it's campus-wide, university-wide, or if it's to an instructional department.
Any other questions?
Gary, you did mention, I believe that at least a few institutions recommended some efforts that might be implemented at a statewide level. Do you recall any of those?
Well, we have talked about increasing the purchasing power. In our Formula Advisory Committee, there was discussions about statewide purchases of utilities. And although some areas of Texas are regulated and there is not a choice for the institutions, there are some opportunities that have not been taken in advantage of in statewide purchasing, such as natural gas, which is not regulated to the municipalities in all areas. So that we've talked about other purchasing opportunities in some of our committees.
Going back to the how do you stratify the costs, across the colleges and universities? I think that would be one of the great outcome from this committee is to get that outlined somehow, so we could get accurate costs. If you don't have accurate costs, your data is kind of skewed, and it may seem like you're doing great in one area, and yet you may be misapplying the definition and moving it into another area. So I think we need to look at that and discuss that, because I think it'd give better clarity in terms of what the figures are and the cost. And then it would set up the metrics for tracking this in later years. Just a thought.
Well, one of the interesting, more creative ideas I saw on this list of institutional savings was from U of H, trayless dining. And I think we're about to experience trayless dining as we break for lunch here.
You are a natural facilitator. That was brilliant. I love that.
And I believe we're having lunch in the Lone Star Room, is that correct? Which is immediately to my right.
So your discussions begin right now in an informal way. Think big, real big. Right next. Yes, I do. Okay.
It was scary what happened with you guys.
Everybody, take your seats. We're going to go ahead and start with our next presentation. I'll get your...
Oh, I hear you. It all turned out okay, but it sure was.
I was telling Al, I want Mike Leach for our offensive coordinator, Dallas Cowboys offensive coordinator. Boy, he's really...
Don't you make me come over here. Don't make me go over there. Okay.
Well, before we all start talking about who's going to hire Mike Leach, we need a defensive coordinator right now. So, we'll get back to Dean here. We've got one more presentation from Lee Holcomb, who is our director. Is he?
I'm right here.
Okay. But a snake that bit me. Lee is director of our Higher Education Policy Institute, our in-house think tank and research institute, and he's going to give us a presentation on recommendations of cost efficiencies based on the analysis of studies in other states.
Before we get started, I want to make sure that we've got the overhead available, but it's not up. You also want to make sure you've got...
I don't think we have that one.
I think I have that one either.
We do we? It says cost efficiency.
Begin to run.
Here. Put that handout. Here.
Thank you.
Like we do.
Lee, if you'll give me 1 second, I just one of the members of our committee did ask me to kind of reiterate what our charge is, and I want to address that just very briefly because after hearing the data and the background we heard this morning, it seems like our task is almost overwhelming, and rightly or wrongly, we've been tasked by the governor to study and address 12 specific categories, if you will, of cost efficiency. And we've added 2 or 3 to that, dealing with facilities and deferred maintenance. What I hope at the end of this series of meetings that we're going to have is that we can, as a committee, can recommend to the coordinating board 3 to 5. What I would say would be 3 to 5 high priority, actionable recommendations for the coming legislative session. But just as importantly beyond that, develop the framework, if you will, for a long-term process of dialogue, data, and recommendations to begin to create a culture of productivity where that process becomes acceptable by these 4 stakeholder groups and there's a shared, a sharing of how we go about that dialogue and developing that process. So, I know it's always sort of a cake and eat it too challenge to a committee to say, well, we want to get some things done in the short term and see some actual results in the next session, but we also got to look to the long term. But that's the challenge that we've laid before this committee, just so we can kind of keep that in view. We hear all this data and analysis, and Commissioner, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think that's right on the mark.
And if we come up with 6 or 7, that just means our chances in the legislature are probably lower, but we really want to prioritize some things that will keep the ball moving down the field, but not take our eye off a cultural change in higher education productivity. So with that, I guess we'll turn it back to Lee's presentation.
FYI, we've got my presentation up here on the overhead on the screen if you prefer to reference that. In our first meeting, I discussed a reading packet that we have put together for you to help you understand the issues as we step through all the different areas in regards to cost efficiencies. And if you've had a chance to take a look at that, it's a pretty thick set of readings. So one of the ways to interpret what I'm going to try to do today is basically give you some of the most salient points from those readings, informed by some additional conversations that we've had with state leaders and national experts since that first meeting. I'm going to go ahead and start off with, next slide please, a brief framing, very simple framing of what it means to think of cost efficiency in higher ed. And It's basically two different approaches. Either you maintain current level of productivity with fewer resources, which I think a lot of states are in a position of at this point in time, namely California, or you increase productivity with current level of resources, which I think we're more in Texas fortunate to be in that situation. Two of the indicators that we've already talked about, Jane in particular, was decreasing overall cost per full-time equivalent student and cost to degree of completion. And what you do when you decrease those is you result in the increased capacity of your overall higher ed system to achieve the closing the gap goals in an era of rapidly increasing population. So, cost efficiency is not just about reducing costs, it's also about being realistic and aware of the overall trends in the population in the state. And lastly, I'd like to mention that most states and institutions have detailed cost data reporting requirements. However, they are typically not combined with productivity data. And one of the challenges that is pretty prevalent in the literature is that one of the challenges facing most states and institutions is to move higher ed from a cost accounting mentality to a cost accountability mentality, and which suggests a strategic allocation of resources that would allow institutions to demonstrate precisely where funds are spent and for what purpose. So that's a brief framing. I'd like to go ahead and step inside. The rest of the presentation is generally organized by the governor's executive order, the study areas. So I'm going to move rather quickly through it, so it might seem kind of choppy, but I'm going to turn my attention first and foremost to outcome-based funding. Although there's plenty of evidence that incentives work, the impact on cost efficiency is not as developed and is less clear, and depends upon the type and amount of the approach. I'm going to step through in the next couple of slides a couple of examples of incentives from different states, and then discuss the special case of completion-based formula funding. Next slide, please. So, different types of incentives. At the institutional level, I draw upon some recent work in Indiana where they focus on increases in the number of different types of degrees from one year to the next. They award $6,500 for every additional baccalaureate degree, approximately $2,500 for every associate's degree. And it's important to note here that the main objective is to increase productivity. And they've done so with a substantial investment in additional funds. So this is not tied towards increasing cost efficiency. This was tied to increasing productivity.
Who does the incentive go to?
The institutions. So that's why it's an institutional level incentive. So whether it is going to result in an increased cost efficiency is a very different question that to this day remains unanswered. A very different type of approach at the leadership level is being adopted, has been recently implemented in the University of Minnesota system. The chancellor has an opportunity to receive anywhere from $3,000 to $15,000 of additional funds over and above base salary for each of 4 performance targets related to online education, underrepresented student enrollments, STEM enrollments, and increase in STEM teachers. Again, the stated purpose of this policy is to increase productivity, not cost efficiency. However, relative to the Indiana approach, you will note that the amount of funds to actually support this policy is substantially less. And they're talking about chancellor salaries, and so it is an increased likelihood that the cost efficiencies could be realized. And it is interesting to note that what's happened in Minnesota is that the chancellor has turned around and attached some incentives at the institution presidential level. And from what I understand, they're then going in and rolling it on down. So that's an interesting approach. At the student level, North Dakota is implementing a very interesting policy where they're essentially that's designed to increase the number of credits that students come in with, college-level credits from their public high school system. They're splitting savings that result from early graduation from college with the student. Again, this is a strong focus on productivity. This has potentially considerable increase in funds. It's difficult to think about what the impact on cost efficiency will be. You will note that I've deliberately selected incentives at the institutional, leadership, and student level. And one of the reasons why is I wanted to point out that one of the things in the incentive literature is you want to be consistent at each level. In other words, you want to make sure your ships are aligned in the same direction. And when you do that, then what you do is you increase the likelihood that the total effect of all your incentives is greater than the sum of the individual effects. Now, there's a concern about incentives, and that is that they're not new, but they're typically short-lived given changing priorities and budget constraints. This is a very important point since the depth of the institutional response is often proportional to both the actual and perceived duration of the incentives. Next slide, please. This is why completion-based formula funding is intriguing. You probably know that current formula funding distributes money based upon the number of students enrolled. There's been a lot of discussion and recommendations to transition to a completion-based formula, which bases on the number of students who actually complete courses in each given semester. The theory is that it will incent institutions to increase course completion rates, and so that leads to increases in productivity. But the key point here is that the size of the pie, in other words, the number of funds, is not going to increase. So you have increased productivity with a given amount of funds, which leads to increase in cost efficiency. What this does is institutionalize, since changes over time in the formula funding are much less likely than typical incentives, like in Indiana, institutions are much more likely to respond systematically, leading to long-term increases in capacity to improve cost efficiency. Lastly, the formula funding itself is very complex and goes much deeper and many more dimensions than simply looking at enrollment versus completion. So a more thorough review is in order to identify opportunities to enhance productivity and cost efficiencies for the formula funding. So for example, would it make sense to develop different formulas depending upon the type of institution? Now I'm going to turn my attention, next slide please, to progress through the education pipeline. In summary, the goal is to reduce student load on the system, and when you do that, that results in increased productivity. And we face a considerable challenge here in Texas when it comes to students graduating with academic skills necessary to be successful in college. 20% of ACT takers are college-ready statewide, compared to 23% nationally. However, Texas has assumed a leadership role in addressing K-12 curricula and assessments that will align and address college readiness. So this work is ongoing. There has been considerable attention and dedication in Texas to financial aid for needy and able students as both an incentive to improve performance and anticipation of college, as well as to reward performance. That is a committee unto itself, but I don't want to get too bogged down here. And lastly, one of the key issues for universities is whether they are well situated to serve the needs of students who enter their institutions with poor academic preparation. And I'll point to the last legislative session that they passed a law designed to charge the vast majority of developmental education be given to community colleges. Policy makes sense insofar in that it gives development ed, because development ed at most universities is often considered by faculty as beyond the charge of the mission. And so this lack of institutional fit itself often leads to some inefficiencies. So along those lines, I think it would be useful for institutions to conduct examinations of admissions policies and standards and how they relate to the level of support they're willing to provide students for success. Next slide, please. Continuing on through the education pipeline, of course, the major link in the pipeline is the transition from 2- to 4-year institutions. Again, there's been tremendous progress in Texas policy front on this front, but I think there are some interesting things happening in other states that we could learn from. Guaranteed admissions to students, who complete transfer focused associate degrees, easy to use and widely advertised web portal with comprehensive information on transfer. These two, you will note, are policies that would require very little investment in terms of cost. So therefore, you would anticipate that you would have some likely increases in cost efficiencies on these two policies. The last example is, again, from Indiana. They actually reward, similar to what they did on degree completion, they reward community colleges for full-time equivalent transfers, and will expand to reward receiving institutions in the next biennium. Now, in contrast, that requires a more substantial cash and investment. So again, the cost efficiencies are unclear. I'm going to turn the next general idea I'd like to address is use of technology in instruction. A particularly promising short-term strategy is, yes?
Do you want questions now, or after you go through all of these?
Whichever you prefer.
In the universities and states that you've studied that have programs geared toward results and outcomes, have you seen a reduction in the number of students admitted, or getting to this access, the issue of access? Have they raised standards so as to increase the likelihood of success?
That is not apparent in the literature that I'm aware of. Now, that is one of the three tension points that was talked about earlier. And I think it is something to consider. But in the particular instances that I've reviewed, I have not seen that. So in regards to technology and instruction, a particularly promising short-term strategy is course redesign, which is typically a partial transition from the traditional lecture model to a learner-centered approach using technology. The unusual quality of this approach is that the evidence shows that when it's done correctly, you can realize both increases in productivity and decreases in cost, as evidenced there by what was going on at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They actually reduced per-student cost by 28%, and the results show that they improved student learning, increased attendance, and also retention over the traditional approach. And one thing I would like to emphasize there is improved student learning. Yes, ma'am.
The devil is in the details. I heard you said when done properly, then it does all this. What is defined properly? What do you mean by that?
Well, the course redesign model is a model that's been developed and taken to the field by Carol Twigg, who you're actually going to hear from in a later meeting. So she'll be able to go into more details. But it's essentially identifying tutoring and assessment technology that is appropriate for specific courses that could be substituted. For example, at University of Wisconsin-Madison, they substituted one lecture and one discussion session a week with student self-guided inquiry through computer-based instruction. And these inquiry platforms, these typically involve, regular assessments throughout the process, so students can have a very clear idea of what their strengths and weaknesses are. And you're getting into a situation where these applications are adaptive. So they identify strengths and weaknesses particular to that student. And so not every student goes through the same sequences, right? So this is, I think, a very promising development.
There's a great deal more variety to course redesign than one might suspect, given that description. But that's an accurate description. But it isn't a single model that's used everywhere. In fact, we have funded some course redesign in Texas, and there may be some argument as to whether we did it correctly or not. But we do have some evaluations of those programs in Texas, and Carol Twigg has many evaluations of programs across the country.
David, correct me if I'm wrong, but we had a presentation, I think it was a year ago this past month, from Carol, and some of the examples involve actually changing the layout of a typical classroom to allow students to be self-guided and to learn at their own pace, and those that need the interaction with the instructor still have that face-to-face interaction. I think
that's correct.
With just a portion of the course being dedicated to lecture and the rest of it this self-guided, self-paced learning where the instructor is able to move around and help those that need help. And so that's what I retained from it as an example.
One of the models related to instruction had multiple computers in a large room, and they had a very simple technology, which is when you needed help, you put your cup on top of the monitor, and somebody came and helped you. And it employed not just regular faculty, but also students who were very good at mathematics as well. So, and Raymond knows a great deal about that.
The only courses that are subject to this kind of redesign that can yield better learning outcomes and cost savings are large, low division courses that virtually all students take. For example, an introductory course in physics, an introductory course in a college algebra course. Another very good example of this is the so-called Math Emporium at Virginia Tech, where instead of going to class 3 days a week, students go to class 2 days a week, and then the third class day they spend in a large computer lab where they do essentially what David said. They work with either peer tutors or with graduate student assistants, and they work on very sophisticated software. That's usually another characteristic of these hybrid courses, that the software to support the courses is quite good. And so that releases a faculty member. If a faculty member is teaching 2 sections of college algebra, and you're going from meeting 3 times a week to twice a week, then you can teach an additional course without adding to your teaching load. And there have been cost efficiencies there. And then there's a lot of research that because kids nowadays spend so much time in front of computer screens, kids nowadays, as you know, spend more time before computers, in front of computers, than they do watching television. That a hybrid model, a conventional lecture or seminar format combined with computer instruction, is a way that most kids learn best.
The Pew Trust recently completed an evaluation of 40 different implementations of course redesign across the country, and if I recall correctly, the average instructional time required of faculty decreased at 33% across the 40 sites, and they had increases in productivity.
That's huge.
Right.
Mike, did you have a comment?
Yeah, just a couple things. I'm convinced that the learning probably is better, but I struggle with understanding how the cost can be less. I've seen changes in technology and course redesign. I've never found them to be less expensive. I found them to be more expensive. I also have yet to find the faculty member who would say that since I only meet two days a week in person and 1 online, then that doesn't count. I think that's going to be an issue too. I mean, we're going to talk about faculty workload, and I'm not convinced that I have any faculty members that would say that was a decrease in their work.
I think there's a difference between what your experience and what this process is, because typically what most institutions have done with technology is have tried to deliver the same type of instruction with technology, and they haven't decreased costs, they haven't increased the number of students involved. I mean, it's and when you do that, costs typically will increase when you do it that way.
And I think one of the key distinctions is these course redesign require additional software purchases on existing hardware platforms. So the level of investment is lower than online learning, which I'm going to get to a little bit later, which is along the lines of what you're talking about.
Okay.
And as the Commissioner mentioned, these are appropriate for large enrollment courses. And for the medium term, Tennessee is along in coordination with ECS, and Carol Twigg is doing a really interesting pilot of an effort to apply course redesign model to developmental education in 6 locations across the state, with an eye towards expanding that to a statewide model, where they would actually realize the cost efficiencies statewide. So, that's a fairly new development, one that we need to keep our eye on.
So this goes outside the box of teacher, blackboard, room, and which has been there forever. I mean, that's been the profile of delivering education for you.
Well, I think the key point is that it uses both.
Right.
And I think one of the takeaways from the first meeting, when you heard all the different views students had on e-textbooks, is people learn different ways. And one of the advantages of this hybrid approach is you've got both approaches. You've got certain students who are really going to take off on the technology piece, and you're going to have certain students who are going to have, probably not like that as much as the traditional lecture method.
You have both approaches, but you don't have 2x the cost.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, one thing that's happening here, and McGregor could correct me if I'm wrong, is that part of what's happening with our course redesign efforts is that it's understood that what they're developing can be used by other institutions as well, which isn't always the case in these efforts that have been undertaken in other states. And our board has addressed, I've forgotten what it's called. We have a site now which is called which essentially we've broken all the electronic components into small increments. So essentially anything that's been developed by one instructor is now housed in a database where faculty can go and pull down those components so they don't have to develop them again. And we entered into a contract with the UT system that has some similar components for the health science centers. And these are being housed in the same place. Learning Objects Repository, an exciting name. But part of where this gets is how you can utilize some development across not only institutions but across systems to reduce some cost, but also preparation time for individual faculty.
And that leads very nicely into my next slide, and looking long-term at what I'm referring to, for lack of a better phrase, as centralized technology backbone. Most basically, there's a number of different things that this could mean, but most basically there's potential to reduce licensing costs of instructional content and training costs, such as the Consortium of Colleges, Community College in Florida has demonstrated. And one of the key questions gets to your point, and that is, what we should do is figure out ways and places where it makes sense for the state to make the very large investments in technology to support online learning. Now, when I say online learning, as everybody understands, that's distinct from these course redesigns. Or online learning is basically completely shifting away from the traditional model to where all or almost all of the instruction is done through the web or technology based. And that kind of approach is much more expensive. And I think it makes more sense for that reason to think about a centralized state role in providing sort of a common IT platform and a common set of tools for all institutions and for all faculty across the state that they could use to develop their own courses, etc. So I think that's an idea that definitely requires some further discussion. And one of the surprising results of our review of the literature is that it is not at all clear how best to calculate costs of incorporating technology in instruction. There are a lot of different ways that it's being done. So, if the state's interested in increasing cost efficiency and understanding how that's improving over time, it definitely makes sense that there needs to be some sort of consensus on how institutions are actually costing their investments out. And lastly, although it's not directly related to cost efficiency, I felt compelled to talk about how online learning is relatively new, and like most new developments in education, and sometimes not so new developments in education, there is tremendous variation in quality on how this is done. So I think one of the things that we would want to take advantage of is sort of an opportunity to examine best practices on how this should be done, and a way to support institutions in supporting their faculty to get to moving forward with quality online coursework. Another long-term, next slide, please. Another long-term idea that's come to mind in the course of conversations is an actual Texas public online institution. There are a number of ways and options that this might be achieved. One is an examination and consolidation of best practices currently in place at various Texas institutions into one model. Or, there's a couple of different existing major providers that could be used as a platform as well. And one thing I would like to end on in this slide is that the current providers like University of Phoenix and Western Governors University are very explicit in that they appeal very much to older adult students. And so one of the advantages of going to sort of a Texas public online option to get degrees is you would attract more adult students into the system and help again serve the cost closing the gaps goals. An additional campus alternative is no-frills education, and this basically is education campuses without the major sports and rec sports and extracurriculars and super gymnasiums. And I think somebody earlier mentioned something along the lines of a floating river now that's gaining currency. There's a couple of very interesting examples of this that's relatively new. Southern New Hampshire University offers a separate campus with the same classes taught by the same professors as the regular campus at 50% tuition rate. An academic at Oklahoma State University estimates that very high quality of education could be offered at just a fraction of the private school tuition. I'm not exactly sure I haven't looked at the details of the analysis, and while you might quibble with the estimate, I think the point remains that the cost could be substantially lower than what typical Ivy League schools charge. And lastly, I'd like to mention that a concern about this approach in the literature is that it would rob students of the typical sort of overarching college experience. And I think that's more of a concern for your younger students. Again, it's not a concern of your adult students. Your adult students are there to learn the content and get the degree. So I think this is another option that would be particularly attractive to adult students.
It occurs to me when we talked about this, before, it didn't occur to me, but this notion of no frills we actually have in place, but we don't have the have tuition there. Because when you talk about, say, the Fort Bend campus of the University of Houston, it is essentially a no-frills campus, but they're paying full freight. We have many off-campus locations for community colleges that don't have frills. So this isn't as an off-the-wall suggestion as it may sound. We just aren't providing a no-frills tuition and fees for these campuses in the same kind of way.
And I'd like to turn my attention to faculty teaching load. Approximately 32% of total costs in Texas higher education are devoted to instruction. So faculty teaching load should be examined in any serious discussion of higher education cost efficiencies. As you can see from a 1992 SHIO analysis in Arizona, there are potentially large increases in the capacity of institutions to serve more students by increasing the average teaching load per semester. University of Maryland system has attracted quite a bit of attention nationally for their overall efforts at reducing, containing costs, and has experienced particular success at increasing average teaching load of its faculty. One of the key points here is that it was well received by the faculty, which was one of the points mentioned earlier. The faculty is very important to get buy-in. Anytime you approach this type of issue. And the way that they did that is basically let the department, gave the discretion to the departments, they empowered the departments on how to actually increase teaching load through a systematic review of how the faculty spend their time on instruction, research, and service. And then I think there are additional, as we mentioned earlier, there are additional efficiencies that I think can be realized by an increased focus on course redesign.
I understand, David, that the Chancellor of the University of Maryland system, Britt Kerwin, will be speaking to this.
It's on May 11th, I believe.
This group about increasing faculty teaching load. What he also did was it was called the Maryland Compact. Kerwin got the faculty to increase its teaching load, but the state made a commitment to maintain certain levels of funding for the University of Maryland system. So it was a bargain between, it was as I say, a compact between the legislature and the university itself.
I have, can I ask some questions about this? First off, you kind of put that in your statement, and I think some of the business people would be very interested, and I think probably some of the public that we heard about earlier would be extremely interested to know that only 32% of all of our costs are dedicated to instructions. I can tell you that the general public thinks that's what we signed up for, just so everybody knows. So 32% spent on instructions is not okay. Under the where you're increasing the course load at the regional universities, I mean, they're already at 4. So the thing that I see missing off of that is increasing the number of students per class or students per section, and that is a way to you can decrease the number of sections and faculty buying into it. I think and I also think it's worth noting that what you talked about that it has to come from the faculty have to buy in, but the faculty didn't decide to increase their course load. They were told to increase their course load, and they got to figure out how. Or they were told to save the money, and they got to figure out how. It's not...
It didn't just happen magically.
Faculty didn't decide to decrease expenses.
Are you telling me the inmates don't run the asylum? Come on, man.
I'm just saying that
the records show that I didn't say that.
Nor I. Anyway, that right there is something that politically, I think probably all of us have to deal with routinely, is the faculty teaching load, and the perception that faculty don't work hard, I think is not accurate, and I think we need to be careful, because what we're saying here is to the untrained eye, 32% of the cost goes to instructions. That's not okay. That they teach 2.5 classes a semester. I've had one of my board members already asked me, he goes, we were given academic leave for a year. He said, how many courses does he teach? I said, 3. He goes, you mean to tell me that he's worked 9 hours a week and he's done that for so long he's tired and he's got to have a year off?
I bet I know who that board member was.
I bet you do too.
And I think you're right. And the reason Lee, I believe, used teaching load versus workload is this is strictly teaching versus all those other things that the faculty member.
Well, if I may add from the community college standpoint, our faculties are pretty much loaded. The issue is the small amount of students that are in each class. And for example, we've had a goal as a board to increase the student load in the classes from about 19, I think we were about 3 years ago, to 23. And for every student we add to a class generally, in that ratio, we save about $1 million. So that is a viable alternative.
The whole idea of course size actually leads into where I'm going, the next slide. In course and program elimination, basically there's tremendous savings that can be realized from decreasing the number of small courses. And the Coordinating Board analysis in 1995 estimates that approximately $7 million savings for each 1% decrease in the number of courses statewide. There may be considerable potential to realize efficiencies in course elimination through institutional reviews of courses that satisfy general education requirements, which would streamline administrative costs as well as result in more courses that would be eligible for course redesign. So if you decrease the number of courses that satisfy gen ed requirements, you increase the average, the size of the courses that remain, and then you can apply additional course redesign models to them and realize even more efficiencies. So I think that's sort of a sequence of efficiencies that you realize there. In regards to operations, on the next slide, Texas has made substantial progress in realizing some economies to scale. We found some interesting things happening elsewhere. For example, institutions in the cross-state Midwest Higher Education Compact have realized tremendous reductions in insurance costs. And in fact, in my conversations with folks, they've even very gently broached the idea of wondering whether Texas would be interested in enjoying those kinds of windfalls as well. Additional options for considerations include energy efficiency standards and approval of new buildings and reporting cost management metrics for each institution over time. I would like to conclude my presentation with comments on the use of data. Texas has a tremendous amount of cost data and accountability data that have been used for a number of purposes, such as increasing retention and graduation rates. I think the next step would be to sort of refocus and redouble efforts to focus on these data for the express purpose of increasing cost efficiency and developing cost efficiency matrices such as cost per FTE student and cost to degree. And I think that one way to look at this is at the beginning of my presentation I talked about how one of the challenges is sort of transitioning from cost accounting to cost accountability. And through this sort of redoubling of efforts to look more specifically at these data, identify practices and disseminate these practices, I think what you do is you start making that transition. And finally, I'd like to in the medium term, does that mean I'm supposed to end? In the medium term, we should consider the development of cost efficiency measures for each study area. So, for example, tracking costs to maintain motor pool over time. And eventually the goal would be able to relate these types of efficiencies to the overall efficiencies such as cost per FTE and cost to degree. And finally, I'd like to end on, I think and ultimately, one of the most important cost efficiency measures is the cost for student learning. I think it's a very important idea because one of the things that you always want to do, as one of our previous presenters discussed, is there's this severe concern on the part of institutions that we're sacrificing quality. So when you develop good, credible measures for learning outcomes, which the coordinating board is very actively engaged in at this moment, hopefully you can eventually begin to establish the costs for those learning outcomes and start tracking those learning outcomes over time. And that concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Lee. Any further questions about these?
Just maybe a suggestion. I was at a conference yesterday that was held by Dr. Rush's CCLP program, and they discussed a model from Washington State which involved incentives. They were called momentum points. And did you look at that, or have you looked at that?
Well, the momentum points are a type of incentive.
Okay.
Right. I mean, that's and so the key point there is you can. You've got a lot of information that you need to decide as a state or as a group what's important, and then you attach incentives, and that's basically what Washington has done.
Do you know the effect of that implementation?
Yeah, the major policy issue at our next board meeting will in fact be on momentum points. Mm-hmm. And we have a presentation from our Regents meeting from Washington on momentum points, so if anyone's interested, we can give you a link to that specific presentation, how it worked. And let me add that at your February meeting, we'll have a Vice Chancellor from Ohio State who, along with changes they've made to their formulas, overall have included momentum points to some extent in there. So you'll have an opportunity for much more detail on this.
Ohio is differentiated between community colleges and the four-year.
And see, but that's a posture we need to. That's why I like the momentum points idea, because it does differentiate, and it provides for the different missions and for the different populations that each of the institutions serve. So,
anecdotally, one of the things with the Washington experience is that they developed the concept, but then didn't get it funded.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know that there was much impact, measurable impact.
It's about 1%, I think, is funded for that. A very, very small amount, because they had a budget crash and it was small to begin with. Our Community College Formula Committee has recommended, in fact, that we look at momentum points as a possible way of proceeding. That's one reason we're having it on our board agenda for January to learn more about it.
Ray has a
question. Do you have any concern about college credit given in high school and whether that course is at the academic rigor that a university or college course would be?
Yes, that is a concern.
Let me address that issue. We're taking a look at that issue. We've been asked by Senator Shapiro to look at dual credit courses. AP courses, of course, have a quality control mechanism, which is, of course, the AP test. Dual credit courses do not, but we will be taking a look at the quality of dual credit courses and make sure that they are legitimate college courses.
The community college leadership has also conducted a study and has some recommendations, I believe, in terms of some quality control elements.
At the community college level?
Yes, in terms of how they can make sure that they don't have the problems on the fringes in terms of some dual credit that may not be as rigorous as others, to ensure that doesn't happen. But they believe it's really a small number of courses.
But I think that question could also be asked of any English class in the state of Texas, and you'd get the same answer because we don't have the quality controls. But what we do have are Southern Association measures, which are, we do look at that, and we do live up to those measures, and the individuals are qualified, and we do try to make sure that we have quality. But we welcome the assessment in our course. Thank you.
Fred, let me ask you, again, this may not be, how much does the state supplement the tuition that's now being charged? In other words, the cost of education is how much per semester at, say, at A&M versus what the state is supplementing? What's that differential? Do we have any idea?
Actually, Susan or Gary?
Just
Did you hear the question, Gary?
Well, I think the tuition figures go something like this. The flagships just about reach national parity at about $8,000 per year, I think. Is that right?
Right.
The non-flagship
Regional
universities are also have neared parity at something.
What does that mean, parity?
Parity with the national average.
But so let's say it's $8,000. What is the actual cost to educate that student? What, per semester or per year?
There was one graph in the.
That's okay. I think that's something we need to understand.
We can get that for you. It's in that $10,000 to $14,000.
Okay.
That's the expenditures per FTE.
So we're covering a little more than half.
And the other point of those graphs was that the share of tuition has been steadily increasing as the subsidy from the state and other sources has dropped.
That's the one you're looking at. That's the FTE.
Kiplinger's got a recent publication on that nationwide.
Oh, that's total all in, including auxiliary, et cetera.
Tuition is the state's putting in $79.59.
Okay, that's across all. Does that include community colleges?
No, it does not.
Just
Just universities.
I can tell you at A&M, our total expenditure at A&M University, the expenditures, it's about a third from the state. I mean, it's almost evenly divided. A third from the state, a third from tuition, and a third from research. And I imagine it's probably the same at University of Texas.
This is the graph that Gary just brought. You all have got this in your materials here, which will answer, at least David, in part, that question.
Now, I should say what the school spends versus what it really costs to educate a student that's a very difficult question.
Yeah.
Is it spending versus sort of minimal cost for the education? They're not the same thing.
Particularly on the community college level, I would suspect. We're talking a great deal of time and attention and effort being given to those students in developmental education. How much is it costing for those students? So, the community colleges do such a tremendous job of getting them ready for four-year institutions. How much does it cost for them to educate that underprepared student, perhaps, than it costs for us to educate the ones that we get in the four-year institutions, I guess is my question.
And that is significant. For us in San Antonio, about 70% of the kids that come to us are placed in developmental math, and maybe a little higher than that. And some of them stay not just 1 year, but maybe 2 years, and some 3 years. And we start losing students as we go. And, in terms of this committee, I think that's one of the areas that community colleges really can look at in terms of efficiencies, in terms of cost savings and the sensitivity we need to have to that area. It is one of the major areas that we have not been able to get a good handle on. And I think the Commissioner has been at us for years now to address it, and I think we're trying to. But I think that's something we really need to look at.
Well, we've, what we want to do with this next 50 minutes or so, actually, 50 minutes is to kind of, with all the data we've heard today, and I'm going to turn this over to Patty, is to synthesize some takeaway ideas and see where there may be some emerging consensus. Patty?
We're going to shuffle a little bit on the schedule, which is what I'm used to doing anyway, because part of your discussion happened when Lee was up here. On your nameplate, you have a color strip. You understand this. And those color strips correspond... I'm sorry?
They're on the name tag.
Name tag, I'm sorry. I meant name tag. Correspond to the pieces of colored paper that are up on these flip charts. Yeah, everybody know where their flip chart is? What we've done is we've divided the group into smaller pods, and those pods are going to be a combination of both higher education and business people, because we want to stimulate some different discussion. Realizing that as I was listening to the presentation, what I'm finding is what is interesting is about faculty workload and online learning and all that stuff. But remember that next month is about outcome-based funding, and that's about course completion, et cetera. And then it's academic and productivity and efficiency in March. So we'll be diving more specifically into all these areas. And then facilities in April and operations in May. Here's what I'd like you to do. Remember those worksheets that none of you have completed at all? I did. Which I fully understand. This is our first good work session. Let me just describe this. At a macro level, if at the end of this, at the end of all of these meetings, we're able to have our 3 to 5 great recommendations, and we are able to prioritize those both on probability of implementation. I mean, would we actually implement this? Could we get the buy-in from faculty to do this? What's the financial impact if it's implemented? And how much time will it take? Is this a decision you can make and just do it immediately? Is it short-term or long-term? We can worry about columns 2, 3, and 4 later. What we need you to do is start looking at what are some of those recommendations. Something else occurred to me as I was listening to y'all this morning. There's probably some no-brainers in here. We should keep a list of those. So if in your pods, if there are things that you have heard at this macro level that you say, why isn't every institution doing this, or why aren't we doing this? Kind of list it as a no-brainer, and let's keep those. We'll review it at the end of the session and see if they still make sense. So keep your list. Here's what I'd like you to do. At every pod, there's going to be a worksheet. Whatever you can get out today, what I'd like to do is I would like for you to write some major recommendations. I know they're not fully formed yet, but and I'm only talking about 3, maybe 3 from each pod, that we can bring back to this group and discuss within 30 minutes. So each pod, your assignment is to write major recommendations, 1, 2, and 3, up on your flip chart, and write them large enough, and then write them on this pod sheet, which we will take up. And then we will discuss when we come back in how probable is it that we could implement this actually in Texas, and what's the financial impact, just generally high, medium, or low?
How probable that we could or would? Which one?
Either. They're kind of the same to me. Another thing is that it occurs to me that you're really going to be looking at some outrageous ideas if you're to attack long term. And the key that I heard today is competition. One of the issues that I always have in working in public sector, or even within large corporations sometimes, in individual teams, is there's no sense of competition. And that is what drives people to make changes. So it's about what's in it for me, what's in it for the faculty, what's in it for the presidents, etc. If you can create a scenario or think about this in terms of you are in competition with X. If you were going to make this more productive and more cost efficient, what would you do? If you're competing against the private institutions, what would you do? You know, the last ad I saw on television this morning before I came over here was about distance learning. It's the guy, and I don't even know who did it, but it was the guy a professor who was talking and said, I've done you a disservice, and then all of a sudden you see him on a computer screen, you see him on an iPod, and then you see him on an iPhone, the same speech. So there is competition out there who are trying to eat into the public's realm, I think. Okay. Any questions? It is now 5 minutes until 2. What if by 2:25, and I will be checking the pods. If I hear Mike Leach's name one time, I'm going to be changing y'all. 2:25, come up with 3 recommendations, and then list any no-brainers over there we need to know about. 2:25, and we'll come right back here.
Mike Leach, actually.
Now that I will disagree with.
Oh, hold on. I need one thing. I was trying to look across these and see which of these were similar. And in the pink, what I found was course redesign in developmental and core courses. Utilize course redesign to leverage and reallocate faculty time over here. And I didn't see it. Is there anything about, did I miss it here or there?
Well, in the orange group, the redesign developmental ed, that means basically what they said over there is redesign the courses in developmental ed.
And that's what that is, too.
What? Well, I just can't read then. Which one?
Brain one.
Well, all right then. Okay. So generally what we need to do, and y'all don't need to do this, is take this and write it more succinctly, because that's going to be one major recommendation at this point. And the thing that I'd like to ask you is this. If you look at this in terms of the probability that higher education could successfully implement this, would you say it's high, medium, or low? And it's all subjective. So how many of you would say that the probability of actually implementing this kind of course redesign is low? Raise your hand. How many of you would say it's medium? Raise your hand. Oh, I bet y'all are going to say it's high. Unless y'all have gone to the beach or something, and I'm up here talking to myself. High?
Could I ask a question, though?
Yes, please.
Part of our recommendation was to move these courses to the colleges, away from regionals, emerging research, and so forth. Just to move them all to the 2-year colleges.
To the community colleges, and that was...
2 of them are up there that say that.
Yeah, our group had that similar concept, but as a separate recommendation. Because some of that could be done even without course redesign, although probably more successful with it.
We need to do course redesign. The blue group, we've got to get better.
Well, that's the same thing.
Okay, let's take it one at a time. What up here should be included on this one? Anything? What up here? What up here? That, didn't sound quite right. Is there anything here that should be included in the pink then? Because somebody just said no? Anything else over here in the course redesign that should go? Or the other one? Okay. Ray?
This course redesign here was focused on remedial work, not general course redesign. So that the universities and the regional colleges and universities and the systems would not have to be spending money on that. That would be focused in the community college, where people are hopefully more geared up to do that.
To do that. Okay, and this one has developmental. This one doesn't have specifically developmental, that one does, but you're all saying basically the same thing? Okay, let's go back to the question. High, medium, or low probability of implementation? Who says high? Just a preliminary vote.
Okay.
Okay, so we'll just put high on there. Has to be high. For my notes. What? Who whispered? And financial impact if implemented. And again, it's all relative. Would this have a high financial impact or a low financial impact? Who says?
On whom?
On higher education. Financial impact.
I think that it'll have a high financial impact on the students.
Yeah.
Okay. So everybody can hear you. High financial impact on the students.
But not necessarily an impact on the system as a whole.
So it wouldn't be a cost efficient, it wouldn't be high in terms of the financial impact on cost efficiency for higher education. Is that what you're saying?
I kind of agree and I disagree. The cost factor of doing developmental ed at community colleges is much lower than at a regional institution or another one. The other thing, too, is if you do a better job at it, the kids can get to the system faster and reduce the cost there. I think that's one of the things you've been saying, Commissioner, for years. So, yeah, it's going to have a system-wide impact, but it also is going to save the kids money. A lot of them that come to us for developmental ed, and I think Greg can testify to this, stay in there too long and they just spin their wheels and spend money that they could, if we prepared them better, if we did a better job, that cost factor would be reduced significantly.
Robert, I think we also have to, you don't want to turn, without me being overly sensitive here, and I don't ever want to be, we don't want to turn community colleges into dumping grounds either.
That's true.
So that's why the number 3 there, community colleges can also teach biology. Community colleges can also teach algebra and a number of other courses more efficiently and very inexpensively. So if you combine, that's why 3 is a little different from those others, because there are savings in sending students through community colleges first.
Exactly.
Before they go on to universities.
Yeah,
so I think that needs to be considered as well.
Some of the students that come to us need developmental attention in math, for example, but not in reading and so on. And so, there's a mixed bag there. But I think, again, that we will have some, there will be college ready in some certain areas, but not in others.
But that's why you have to do both, I think, and emphasize both, because the students will want to stay away if the perception becomes, I'm going to a community college, and that's the developmental place.
In Blues, in our idea, you may be teaching, community college may be teaching on the university campus. Yeah. But the community college has more expertise in this area. And when we talk about cost, looking at what is the cost of the system, but in that case, we're looking at what is the cost to the student and his parents. It may be actually lower for them without having an impact on the university's bottom line, but looking out for the parents and the students.
Let me say, students who are not ready for ready for college are going to be remediated somewhere. Okay, so the question really is not so. The question is where. And from my point of view, I would like to see all the developmental budgeting budget dollars move from the four-year institutions to the community colleges. I mean, it just makes sense.
I agree with Bernie as I think a president of a master's level institution. I would like for us to get out of the business of developmental education. We're not prepared to do it, don't have the faculty for it, and I think it would be a cost saving for us and a cost saving for our students. And I think probably colleges are better prepared to do that than we are. It's very difficult for us to move internally. We've slowly moved in that direction. But I agree with Bernie. I don't want colleges to have the appearance of being a dumping ground either. Never intended to do that. I would just like to get out of the business of a master's level institution doing that kind of work. We're not prepared for it, really.
Okay, I'm going to ask, Yes. I'm going to ask that we stop this discussion so we can get through the rest of these, because we've only got 25 minutes left, and we have another meeting here at 3. So I took some notes on it. What we did say, it's high probability of success. Let's go back to the financial impact based on our discussion. If it's implemented, and you said it was high probability, what would the financial impact overall be? High, medium, low? Who says high?
High in a positive.
Financial impact?
High, yes.
High in a positive fashion.
Positive impact. You'd save money. Be cost efficient. Who says high? Who says medium? Who says low? Okay, so I'm going to say that's an M+. And just briefly, is this something that you can implement immediately? Or is it a 2-month implementation, or is it going to take well over half a year to a year? Who says it's well over half a year? Well over. Work with me here, people. It's going to take longer than 6 months.
In this business, it takes more than a half a year to turn the calendar.
Okay. So it's long term. Okay, we got that one out of the way.
Your faculty are listening.
Okay, let's go to outcome-based funding measures. I saw it on this one in the yellow. I saw here. And this one says focused on success completions, which doesn't negatively impact either quality or access. Did I see it anywhere else?
Number 3 on ours. Just didn't write it out.
Incentives? Is that,
yes, yeah.
Okay.
Refine incentives that we've started, yeah.
All right. Let's talk about that. Tell me a little bit more about that, if anybody meant something different than what's up there.
Well, in our group, and Woody led off on this idea, we in closing the gaps nomenclature, that's why we use the word success. Closing the gaps is about 4 goals: participation, success, excellence, and research. And there was the feeling that we really, and this has been a discussion that's been ongoing for a while, not just at the start of this committee, but that we need to now elevate success as we go past closing the gaps as the most important of those goal areas as measured by outcomes. Outcomes being degrees, certifications, transfers, all completions.
Okay. Any other comment on this one?
We talked about tailoring those because different student populations had different challenges going through the system. We want to make sure that we didn't think a common incentive would work.
Okay, so tailored or customized. Okay.
We started to try to solve all that, and Patty wouldn't let us get in the minutiae.
Who said that? Because I can't tell from that. Because, I am coming back next month. Y'all know that, right? Okay. Any other comments on this one? High probability of implementation? Think about it from all the stakeholders. High, medium, low.
What kind of timeline?
Yeah.
You want to start with timeline first? How long is it going to take you to do this? What do y'all think?
Accession.
Do what? Accession. So this is long-term?
It's already being implemented. It's part of our funding now.
But we're talking about going all the way, though. I mean, we're in a funding system where the formula changes, where it only pays for completion. And we've got incentive funding today that's a bit small.
Mm-hmm. I guess it is small, yeah. And our committee was talking about raising that amount too and refining it some.
Transition. And I'm
Okay.
saying you could adopt it early, but you have a long transition.
I agree.
period to protect
Yeah.
those
Okay.
that needed to adjust to the
Agree.
new reality. The adoption should come earlier, but the transition of full effectiveness might be 10 years. And what do you know?
Well, we propose that you implement 25% per year, so it would take 4 years to fully implement once it was adopted by the legislature, and others have said we ought to do it 20% a year, so it would take 5 years. But it would take 4 or 5 years minimum to fully implement.
Pay by course, and we're going the next step, pay by degree.
Right.
So let's say it's long-term, okay? And what's the probability of implementation? Is this kind of a no-brainer, this has to be done? So is the probability high?
You can tell me what is the it first.
The outcome. What is the outcome?
The probability is higher than it was in the last session.
Okay.
End of course funding or degree funding? I'm not understanding what it is you're asking.
Well,
outcomes-based.
Some sort of outcome.
I'd say that at the broad concept level we're at today, the probability is high. Whether my idea of what it ought to be, or Woody's idea, or Mike's, or Rick's, or whomever, there are going to be some strategies that'll be much more difficult to implement than others. And I think another big thing which we'll deal with is, last time we basically had the same recommendations, albeit maybe different dollar levels, for 4 years in community colleges. This time I think we're focused on better tailoring what that means for community colleges as opposed to the 4-year institutions, which hopefully will increase its probability. So
could we
something, I think it's a high probability for something in that direction to get done.
Kind of like healthcare?
Kind of like, yeah, boy, I hope it's not that
And education.
Let's make sure we don't forget also, it's not just community colleges versus four-year institutions, but it's also health-related institutions that fit a different category also.
And as a graduate of a historically black college, I must indicate that Texas Southern Prairie View have as an emphasis developmental education as well. So that's not, we can't say with a broad swath that we want to get out of developmental education in four-year institutions. There are some institutions that have that as their emphasis, even at a four-year institution. So keep that in mind.
Great point.
I hate to beat this, but I had written a note. It's funny you said that about health care. I think we can throw this healthcare reform in there. I think that healthcare reform, we should start paying the doctors based on how well their patients get.
I like that, actually.
That's very similar to what you just said.
The ultimate outcomes-based funding.
And we've drifted off once again.
Then they won't let us drink and smoke.
So I'm saying, I'm going to guess right now, it's between medium and low probability of implementation. Correct? It's not high.
Medium.
Okay. Can we put medium just temporarily? All right. Okay. And what is the financial impact if it was implemented?
Big. Not for health science centers.
Not for health.
They're broke, so.
Okay. High, medium, low.
No. It depends on how much money.
Depends on what we mean by big.
Because if it's big, that would mean we're not graduating students, or we're not being successful. If it were
Increasing productivity.
Right.
Okay, yeah, that's what right. That's a different.
Well, we also have to differentiate what kind of completion we're looking at, because this can become very punitive for community colleges because of our. Okay, that kind of completion I can live with.
We don't have to solve all these problems today. All I want is a high, medium, or low. Medium? Medium financial impact?
Yes. High.
High impact.
Financial, a lot of it, you say financial.
Okay, we'll do medium.
Medium implementation, high impact.
Okay,
The
I'm gonna do
impact
medium.
would be a great increase in productivity with no additional cost to the state.
Right.
There you go.
Yes.
Okay, let me just write that down.
The definition of financial impact.
I'm saying?
State appropriations or?
Okay.
Well, I know that's why I keep clarifying.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, because I would think it would be.
Okay, one conversation. Hold on.
I know.
Who, was that Lori? Who was talking?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, there you go.
I really am struggling with sort of the categorization because of the complexity of these issues.
Right.
I worry about sort of putting things on and putting it locked in. I mean, I just don't. I can argue probably any of those levels on any of those categories, depending on how we ultimately define.
Yeah.
I think we're going to have a whole session on this outcome-based funding. Am I not? I don't remember which session it is. So we'll get into it deeper. This is just first blush stuff. I don't think you're married to anything. I'm just glad we have one or two ideas here. All right, let's go to, what's the next one? Got that one, that one. Finding the common ground and the four perception. Let's leave that one for just a second.
Yeah, 1 minute.
Okay, this one, the greater use of community colleges to partner with institutions of higher education to reduce cost, increase success of early years. Should that be combined with this?
No, once we finish doing all the developmental education, we can also teach those other courses at a discounted price relative to universities, and if you utilize community colleges more, you can save money.
I think Gregory needs to be on the business side, not the academic side.
You can use models like we have with A&M, where you have dual enrollment.
Yes.
The Bloom team was, in fact, I wrote Bloom team up there as an example of the kind of partnership.
Well, our new A&M
And
campus.
go do as some states have done. Lee alluded to this in his presentation. Go deliberately to essentially a 2+2 higher education system, where the bulk of students who go on to higher education start off in community colleges.
Exactly.
Yep. That system would save
2+2 states.
many millions of dollars.
And that's why I say if you do that in conjunction, I have no problem with the developmental ed, but if you bring the other with it, then we're not just targeted as developmental ed schools. We can do more than that. That was my point.
Okay, can we take a...
Do it well.
Can we do a quick assessment of this one? What's the probability that this could actually be implemented? Does this make sense to you? High, medium, or low?
What's this?
This.
That's the problem, we don't know what this is.
Say it again, Greg. They weren't listening. I was.
Greater utilization of community colleges in the first 2 years of study.
And that's not just the developmental, but it's pushing, I don't want to say pushing down, but pushing across.
That the bulk of lower division work is done by community colleges.
I like that. I mean, forcing into the categorizations is problematic. I think it's low in my mind to a state where we'll get sort of the 2+2 probability. I think it's absolutely, I think it's high if we're talking about continued partnerships which already exist, trying to direct more activities toward community colleges, trying to increase access by I mean, so to me they're very different and kind of.
Here's one facet of it that I think maybe Scott's driving at. There was a recent successful effort to align the courses for mechanical engineering degree between community colleges to allow seamless transfer into all but 2 or 3 of our upper division mechanical or 4-year mechanical degrees. So one way to affect what is being talked about is to just require curriculum and course alignment so that this seamless transfer is possible from any community college to any of our 4-year institutions without all the Mickey Mouse and rigmarole that we go through. Now, there are going to be some higher level partnerships that may not be one size fits all, but Blend Team I think is a good example that UT could choose to replicate with Austin Community College or UTSA or Texas A&M San Antonio with Alamo Community Colleges. I mean, that is a model that I think can be replicated. However, the scale is, what, Mike, 600 students a year that are in that program out of a 49,000 student campus. So you also have to keep the scale in mind and how expandable is it as well as replicatable.
Well, one of the things we need to look at in this whole process is how many collaborations we can get out of this thing, because there's where some of the efficiencies are going to be. The other thing, too, like at the conference I went to yesterday, someone was talking about course alignment, like you're talking about, Fred, and they looked at what the community colleges were doing in certain areas, and when they transferred over to 4-year universities, some of those universities had titled their courses differently, but it was the same course, and so the kid took the course again, and so tuition costs were incurred there. So we need to really look at that alignment, that collaboration, continued partnership.
Well, and that's, I think on a collaboration standpoint, I absolutely agree. UTEP and El Paso Community College has partnership. Dallas has something. I think the challenge will be if it's sort of a mandate from the top in terms of a blanket thing, and then there'll be arguments of quality, et cetera. But I think if there are ways to facilitate those collaborations and or create incentives, then I think it's actually very doable, and it's already proven.
I love this discussion, and what you may have done up here is already identified on these the top 3 to 5 recommendations, and the good news is we'll have time to flesh these out through the next sessions. So let's just do this partnership, high, medium, low. What are the chances of the probability of implementing this kind of partnership? High?
If it's a partnership, as Scott said, I think it's very high. If it's forced, it won't.
Medium? This is assuming buy-in. Medium? Low? Okay, let's say high. And the financial impact, if it is implemented, high, medium, or low? Overall?
Well, if it's impacted to the level I think Gregory was envisioning, it would be high in a good way. Mm-hmm. It would drive down the cost of the first half of a 4-year degree.
Okay. High? Raise your hand. Medium?
It's the scalability.
Low? You were kind of alone there, right?
I know.
Okay, good.
I'm not going to shoot.
Stand your ground.
All right. Well, we're going to work that one out. And is this something that can be done immediately? Obviously not. It's probably not short term. I think we need to redo the short term and long term.
I mean, this 2+2 concept.
This is long term, correct? What'd you say?
Partnership thing is good. But
okay. All right. Let's see what else you got here. Oh, that was the example for this, seamless transfer and blend?
Strategic use of tuition discount.
Tuition discount.
Strategic use of tuition discounts. Is this a separate one? Who had
Yeah,
this
well,
one?
actually, it's more of a, kind of one of those student incentives. The issue really was, we talked about potential discounting for no-frills campuses. I think there are other ways to potentially create student incentives for attendance at low, at non-peak times, at either hours of the day, weekends, or different periods of time over the summer, et cetera. I just think...
Just get the faculty to teach at those times.
Well, no, I'm...
We will.
Okay.
Just don't say productivity.
Strategic use of tuition discounts. Is this, shall we look at this one seriously? Any other comments on this? So tuition discounts in all kinds of situations. All right. What's the probability of implementing something like this?
High.
High? Mm-hmm. Would there be a great financial impact? A high? And when I say high, I always mean cost efficiency or cost savings to the state, not to the students.
If you don't have to build new buildings, I'd say it's high.
Okay, that's one thing.
Utilization increases, yeah.
So utilization increases. Okay, so
Potentially
that's
more students.
potentially more students. Okay, anything else? Only I can read this. And so high, medium, or low financial impact. Who says high? Everything else has been kind of high here. So who says medium? Who says low? I'm going to say medium. We'll change it later. And if
Long-term, short-term.
the financial...
Long-term, short-term.
Oh, yeah, long-term, short-term. Is this something that can be done? Hey, is this a short-term deal? Short-term or long-term?
Short-term.
Short-term?
Well, in theory, it seems like something could be done pretty short-term, but those who administer these policies need to weigh in, and how quickly could we... Some universities are already using it, flat tuition, that kind of thing.
Flat tuition?
Is one example.
I think it's short.
I just think when we do this on the last time, you need to redefine what's immediate, long-term, and short-term.
Yeah, I think that needs to be redefined.
I'm really curious that in this business, there is no such thing as...
Short-term.
I know,
The only thing
okay.
that's immediate is firing your head coach.
Gotta fix that. Go back to this. Okay, this is operational, correct? Combined system. Okay, guys, I got like 4 more minutes. Combined systems. Is this human resources?
No.
What?
Combined systems is...
Higher.
It's the university systems. That's like the University of Texas system and the A&M system and the Texas State.
Oh, now you got their attention.
Over here, it said outrageous ideas. You put
System realignment.
Okay, now we're talking.
And HRIs are health-related institutions.
Okay, thank you. Sorry I didn't do that. Okay, discuss. What do y'all think about that?
So does that say combine HRIs into systems, or actually combine
All the systems.
the systems
To one big system.
into one big system, or 4
one
big
big
systems,
system.
or...
HRIs ought to be
Mission-based
in,
systems
my
like
thing
that.
is, HRIs should be in a single system, whether it's the University of Texas system or their own system. I don't care, but I just think that's an expertise to run those things that doesn't exist everywhere.
We get quiet in here.
Figured it was going to.
Well, let me just ask you this. What's the probability that that would be implemented?
Long term.
But this is outrageous ideas. I mean, you think about...
That's why I asked could or would.
That's right.
Could we do it? Yes.
Okay. So maybe it's low probability, but what's the financial impact?
Huge.
Thank you so much.
It's big.
And how long would it take to implement that and fire some of the UT systems people?
How long does it take for hell to freeze over?
Very long term. Commissioner, I'm going to love seeing you bring that forward, that idea. That'll be great. Okay.
How many commissioners would it take?
Okay, my friends, we got a couple more here. 4-day school, Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Thursday classes. What is this?
There's two different ones. 4-day school, in other words, shut the school down on Friday, save operational costs, so forth and so on.
And
that will go perfectly well with the one that doesn't have any frills, because if you only run it for 4 days, you won't have any students to have frills. So.
Okay.
The 6-day schools take advantage again of the facilities with Lincoln Dallas, teaching them on Saturdays and things like that. It's similar to
You set the hours, but you set the hours based on how you can be most productive. In certain campuses, 6-day a week is the most productive use of buildings. In others, it may only be 4-day a week.
Okay. What do y'all think about that? Any other comment?
Doesn't really focus on the student.
Doesn't focus on the student, okay.
If you're a commuter, it does. If you don't have to drive in on Fridays. I mean, this is a green proposal.
Oh, he's really getting out there, isn't he? Don't put that
But if
green-
it is a commuter school, it also kills businesses and things of that nature on that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. We tried.
Yeah, almost looking at it the other way around. The commuter schools and the schools with a higher adult population might go for the 6-day week.
Yeah.
And the traditional schools, so-called traditional schools, where kids don't go to class on Fridays anyway.
Okay, I got a recommendation. Why don't we take this one up last time? The one that I think probably the last one we should discuss is this health insurance pool. I'll take all these down, but health insurance pool for all higher education. Combine UT, A&M, and all others.
That's kind of a provincial deal. University of Texas and A&M system have our own insurance
pools.
Our own insurance companies. And frankly, we've worked on that before. We've talked about trying to combine them. The other universities, the other higher education part of the employee retirement system, community colleges catch can on a whole bunch of it. There is money to be saved in putting us all into the University of Texas health insurance.
What do y'all think about that?
Great.
If it could be done without creating another agency.
Okay.
It's not just health insurance. I mean, it could be there are a lot of things that could be procured statewide for all our institutions, at least theoretically.
So so look at all procurement here. Maybe this could be a more general category. One of the things of which is health insurance.
I would challenge that a little bit from an actuarial perspective, and I don't pretend to be an actuary, but isn't UT and A&M, for example, already large enough with a critical mass to have major buying power? And after a while, your buying leverage starts to level off because you can't buy it less than cost. Just a thought.
Okay.
Administration would be different, but actuarially, that's probably.
Okay. Any other comments about that? Any potential for the community colleges to pool? I don't know if that's legally.
Savings there, isn't there?
What do you think, Greg? I think it would be something we certainly want
It
to
would
look at.
stabilize a lot of things for us as well.
So the focus may be on the community colleges, right? Okay. Very quickly. Probability of being able to implement something like this. High, medium, or low? High? Medium?
Scott, you've done this within the UT system, right? How difficult has that been to do just within a system?
Well, for healthcare for a while, we've done procurement. I mean, the issues with procurement generally, there are sort of three things. One is buying powers initially, but then two, it's standardization of the things you buy, and there you have to get buy-in from all the individuals, and you get larger, and sometimes it becomes more problematic. And then the third, which is the strategic sourcing element, is really guaranteed spend at particular vendors. So the other piece is to have a policy, operations, et cetera, so that well, it's not always absolute, but that you can sort of deliver a particular spend to a vendor. That's what drives those things down. So the first one, as you get bigger, it really helps. The last two, you you do reach a critical mass, and Raymond said it well, and then at some point, you really become less effective. Like even the health group purchasing organizations, we can get better prices than they can, even though they have a larger spend because of those customized spends that we're able to provide.
Okay.
Well, so, the probability of successful implementation, I think within a system it's high. Statewide, I guess if you could, I'd say medium, because if you got to establish some sort of consortium to avoid a new agency.
And then again, it depends on the spend, like, insurance is a big case. We mentioned that the Midwest Consortium, Midwest States Consortium served well. There are some things which you can work well.
Yeah.
In a broader area of purchasing, there are already electronic bulletin boards that we're authorized to buy off of. There's already a well-established group purchasing system in the states.
And that was some of the more frequent, higher impact examples that we had from what the institutions are already doing.
And the financial impact of that, if it was actually implemented, would be high, medium, or low overall, comparatively speaking. High, medium, low. Want to go home? I'm going to say medium. Okay, and...
I think if you're talking about the example we saw from the examples was $27.7 million, that sounds like a lot of money till you look at the combined higher education budget.
Right.
So how much could you ramp that up? How scalable is that?
Okay, and I suspect that would be a long-term implementation. All right, let's do this. We're 1 minute over, and we've got to set up for a new meeting. I will take this information and make sure y'all get it back. It's just the beginning of the discussion. Anything else y'all need to say out loud right now?
Patty, you mentioned keeping a no-brainer list. I don't know that it's easy to implement, but the idea about finding the common ground in the 4 segments seems like a no-brainer. And the idea that I think Ray or someone brought up about, did you take the chief executives from institution or system A, faculty from system B, financial officers from system or institution C? That's something we ought to talk about. It maybe that could be a no-brainer.
That's what we worked on. Okay, I will keep that. All right, thank y'all so much. This is a fabulous day. Be safe.
Thanks everybody for coming.
It is a story. Yeah. Very good. Yeah.